Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and the planet quietly reminds us that it has never been as simple as it looks. Tonight, we're heading into one of the most famous landscapes on Earth, a place so vast and sunlit that from a distance it can seem almost empty. The Sahara. A name that brings to mind dunes, heat, silence, camel caravans, and skies so wide they make every thought feel a little smaller. It is the largest hot desert in the world, stretching across North Africa like a golden ocean frozen in place. It is easy to imagine it as a blank space, a place where life has retreated, where history has been erased, where the map itself seems to breathe out and say, "Not much here, carry on." But the Sahara has been keeping secrets, quite a lot of them actually, and like many quiet places, it turns out to have a very long memory. Before we begin wandering through those old sands, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you somewhere cold and rainy, tucked under a blanket while the wind presses at the windows? Are you somewhere warm, where the evening air still holds the heat of the day? Have you ever stood in a desert, or seen one from an airplane window, and wondered what might be hidden beneath all that space? There is something fitting about listening to the story of the Sahara from different corners of the world, because deserts have a way of making distances feel real. They stretch the imagination, they make time feel longer, and they remind us that the Earth is not just a place we live on, but a place that has lived through many versions of itself before we ever arrived. If you find this kind of journey soothing, interesting, or just a gentle way to let the day loosen its grip, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this quiet little corner of Earth science reach others who might also enjoy drifting through ancient landscapes, strange discoveries, and the slow, surprising history of our planet. And I do hope tonight's journey is calming enough to help you rest, though I should warn you, the Sahara has a habit of becoming more interesting the longer you look at it. So if you find yourself still awake, picturing vanished lakes, stone circles, buried cities, and glass made by fire from the sky, well, at least your mind will be travelling somewhere extraordinary while your body gets comfortable. So settle in, let your shoulders soften, let the room around you become still, and imagine for a moment the Sahara not as it appears today, but as a place with layers, not just sand above rock but present above past. One desert laid over an older world. A world of grasslands, rivers, wetlands, animals, settlements, tools, art and people who looked up at stars that are still there tonight, even if the land beneath them has changed beyond recognition. The Sahara we see now is not a mistake in the landscape. It is not an empty page. It is more like a closed book with a cover made of dust. At first glance, the Sahara seems to encourage simple thinking. It is dry, it is hot, it is difficult to cross. It has killed travellers, swallowed armies, protected kingdoms, and discouraged casual wandering for thousands of years. The name itself has become almost shorthand for absence. We say deserted when we mean empty. We talk about wastelands as if nothing of value could be there. But this is one of those cases where everyday language quietly leads us astray. The desert is not empty. It is only selective about what it reveals. In some places, wind removes the surface grain by grain and exposes stones that have not seen daylight in hundreds of thousands of years. In other places, sand covers ancient camps, bones, tools, carvings, and the ruins of communities that found ways to live where modern eyes might see only hardship. The Sahara does not preserve everything, but what it does preserve can be astonishing. Think of it like an attic belonging to the planet. Not a tidy attic, of course. More of a vast, sun-blasted attic with no roof, no labels, and an alarming amount of sand in the corners. But still an attic. A place where old things remain because nobody has fully cleared them away. The Sahara keeps evidence of climates that no longer exist, animals that no longer roam there, human groups that moved through it before written history, and technologies that seem almost impossible for the environments they occupied. It holds traces of lakes where there are now dry basins. It holds images of crocodiles and hippos carved into rock, where today those animals would find very little to recommend the neighbourhood. It holds stone tools shaped by hands so ancient that they may not have belonged to modern humans at all. It holds pieces of yellow glass scattered in remote places, glass that seems to have been born from a violent event so hot that the desert itself briefly melted. The strange thing about the Sahara is that the more we learn about it, the less it resembles the simple desert of imagination. It becomes a time capsule, but not the neat kind buried with a ribbon and a date. It is a broken, scattered, enormous time capsule, one that must be read across thousands of kilometres. A stone circle in Egypt, a carving in Libya, a cave painting in Algeria, a line of underground tunnels beneath old Garamantian lands, a fossil aquifer deep below the surface, a circular geological formation visible from space. Each piece seems separate at first, like scraps from different stories. But together they point to a much larger truth. The Sahara has not always been the Sahara. That may sound obvious in one sense. Landscapes change, rivers move, forests expand and retreat, sea levels rise and fall, mountains erode. But the scale of change in the Sahara is difficult to hold in the mind. It asks us to imagine a place that is now one of the driest regions on Earth, turning, at intervals, into a greener world. Not a tropical paradise in every direction, not a cartoon oasis with politely arranged palm trees, but a broad, living landscape where rainfall reached farther inland, lakes filled, grasses spread, and animals followed water across what are now dry plains. During some periods of the African humid period, parts of the Sahara supported ecosystems that would look completely out of place to us today. People lived within those ecosystems, moved with them, hunted within them, painted them, navigated them, and eventually watched them change. And that is where the real story begins to deepen. Because the lost world of the Sahara was not just a story about climate, it was a human story too. When the rains came, people entered. When lakes grew, people gathered. When animals moved, people followed. When the sky became predictable, people began to track it. When water became rare again, people adapted, migrated, engineered, or disappeared into the record in ways archaeology can only partly recover. The Sahara, in this sense, is not only a landscape of dunes, it is a record of human resilience written in stone, bone, pigment, and dry earth. It shows us that people have been reading environmental change for a very long time, even if they did not use the words we use now. One of the most remarkable things about desert archaeology is that it often begins with something small. A chipped stone lying on the surface, a fragment of pottery, a faint engraving on a rock wall, a line of stones that looks natural until someone notices it is too deliberate. A dry lake bed that seems ordinary until sediment tells another story. In wetter climates, organic material decays quickly. Plants reclaim abandoned places, and rivers disturb evidence. Deserts are harsh, but they can also be excellent at preservation. Their dryness can protect fragile traces. Their winds can uncover old surfaces. Their emptiness, or what looks like emptiness, can make the human mark stand out if you know how to look. The Sahara hides things, yes, but sometimes it hides them in plain sight. Imagine walking across a flat desert plain and finding stones arranged in circles older than the pyramids. Not towering monuments, not polished temples, not the sort of thing that announces itself with grand staircases and souvenir stalls, but low stones placed with care by people who lived more than 7,000 years ago. At Nabta Playa, in southern Egypt, archaeologists found such arrangements, along with evidence that ancient people were watching the heavens with attention. These were not people wandering aimlessly through a wasteland. They were people who understood seasons, directions, and the importance of timing in a changing environment. When the rains were uncertain and water shaped survival, the sky mattered. The rising of stars, the position of the sun, the return of seasons, all of it could become part of life's practical rhythm. The stone circles of Nabta Playa remind us that astronomy did not begin in marble observatories or modern textbooks. It began with people outside looking up, needing to know when the world would change. Then travel west in the mind, across the desert into Libya, where rock carvings show animals that seem almost like jokes played by geology. Hippos, crocodiles, elephants, giraffes, creatures that belong near water, vegetation, and richer ecosystems. They appear on stone in places where the modern landscape feels almost aggressively dry. These images are not random decoration. They are memory made visible. Someone saw those animals. Someone took the time to carve them. Someone lived in a Sahara where such creatures were possible. It is hard to think of a clearer reminder that the present landscape is only one frame in a much longer film. The desert did not always look like this. The animals knew it. The people knew it. The rocks still know it, in their quiet, rocky way, which is not very talkative but can be quite persuasive over long periods. And then there are the Garamantes, a civilization that once flourished in the central Sahara in what is now southwestern Libya. If the phrase Saharan civilization sounds surprising, that is only because the modern desert has trained us to underestimate the past. The Garamantes built towns, farmed, traded, and developed a remarkable system of underground irrigation tunnels known as fogaras. These channels tapped fossil groundwater and carried it toward fields and settlements, allowing agriculture in a region where surface water was scarce. It was engineering on a scale that feels both impressive and slightly exhausting to imagine. Thousands of kilometers of underground channels cut through the earth, maintained by labour, knowledge, and organisation. The Garamantes were not merely surviving in the desert, they were reshaping parts of it, drawing hidden water out of the ground like a secret the landscape had not meant to share forever. This is one of the themes that returns again and again in the Sahara's hidden history. Water. Where it was, where it went, where it remained hidden, and how people found it. Some of the water beneath the Sahara today is fossil water, trapped underground for tens of thousands of years, stored in aquifers from wetter periods. It is not rain from last season. It is ancient water, sealed away below a dry world, like a memory the earth kept under pressure. Modern wells can reach it, but it does not refill quickly on human timescales. That makes it both a resource and a warning. The Sahara's underground water reminds us that landscapes can carry the remains of old climates long after those climates have vanished. The surface may say desert, but below it there may be evidence of rain that fell before cities, before writing, before much of the world we recognise. And the Sahara does not only preserve human effort and ancient water, it also preserves violence from beyond the ordinary surface of Earth. In the Libyan desert, scattered across a remote region near the border of Egypt and Libya, pieces of Libyan desert glass lie in the sand. Smooth, yellow-green, and strange, they were formed by temperatures so high that ordinary geological processes struggle to explain them. The leading explanation involves a cosmic impact or airburst, an event in which extraterrestrial material entered Earth's atmosphere and released immense energy. The desert was heated with such intensity that silica melted and became glass. Later, much later, a piece of that glass would be carved into a scarab and placed among the treasures of Tutankhamun. There is something quietly astonishing about that connection. A violent event from deep time, preserved as desert glass, then carried into the symbolism of ancient Egypt, resting with the young pharaoh whose tomb became one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in history. The Sahara has a long reach. Sometimes it reaches into royal jewellery. Some mysteries are harder to place neatly into explanation. In the Tassili Naja region of Algeria, cave and rock paintings preserve one of the most extraordinary galleries of prehistoric art in the world. Among the cattle, hunters, animals and scenes of life are strange figures often called the Roundheads. They have large, rounded forms, unusual proportions, and an appearance that has inspired all kinds of speculation. Some people have rushed toward dramatic claims because humans do enjoy sprinting toward aliens whenever ancient art gets a little unusual. But even without those leaps, the figures are fascinating. They show symbolic worlds we do not fully understand, made by people whose beliefs, rituals and stories are mostly beyond recovery. We can study pigments, dates, styles, and archaeological context, but we cannot simply step inside their minds. The paintings remind us that the lost Sahara was not only ecological or technological, it was imaginative, it was cultural. It was full of meaning for the people who lived there, even when that meaning now reaches us only as shapes on stone. And then, as if stone circles, green deserts, underground waterworks, ancient tools, cosmic glass, and mysterious paintings were not enough, the Sahara offers one more enormous question mark visible from space. The Risha structure, also known as the Eye of the Sahara, is a giant circular formation in Mauritania. From above, it looks almost too perfect, like a target pressed into the earth. For a long time, people wondered whether it was the remains of an impact crater. Today, many geologists explain it as an eroded geological dome, shaped by uplift and erosion rather than a confirmed meteor strike, though its appearance continues to invite questions and debate in popular imagination. What matters for our journey is not forcing it into one answer too quickly, but noticing what it represents. The Sahara is not flat, simple, or finished. It is full of structures that only make sense when you think in deep time, when you allow rock to rise, crack, weather, and be stripped away layer by layer until hidden patterns appear. All of this makes the Sahara feel less like a desert and more like an archive. Not an archive with quiet lamps and helpful filing cabinets, unfortunately. More like an archive where the documents are buried under dunes, written in minerals, scattered by wind, and occasionally guarded by scorpions. Still, the record is there, and when scientists read it carefully, a different Sahara emerges. A Sahara of lakes and savannas, a Sahara of people watching stars, a Sahara of animals now gone from those regions, a Sahara of cities, tunnels, trade and adaptation, a Sahara of tools so old they push us back toward earlier humans and their relatives, a Sahara touched by impacts from space and marked by geology that stretches the imagination. The desert is not empty. It is crowded with time. This matters because we often think of lost worlds as places that vanished completely. A city swallowed by jungle, an island drowned by the sea, a civilization erased by conquest. But sometimes a lost world is still right there, only transformed so thoroughly that we stop recognizing it. The Sahara's lost world did not disappear behind a locked door. It dried, shifted, cracked, and changed until its evidence became strange to us. A crocodile carved in stone becomes a puzzle. A dry lake bed becomes a clue. A buried water channel becomes proof of engineering. A piece of glass becomes the trace of unimaginable heat. The past did not leave. It became difficult to read. There is something useful, maybe even humbling in that. The earth is not fixed. The landscapes we treat as permanent are often temporary arrangements. Forests can become plains, plains can become deserts, rivers can vanish, lakes can return and disappear again. Human life adapts within these changes, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes painfully, and sometimes not at all. The Sahara shows this on a grand scale. It reminds us that climate is not a background decoration. It is one of the main forces shaping where people go, what they build, what they eat, what they fear, what they worship, and what they leave behind. And it reminds us that even the driest places may carry evidence of abundance if we learn to look beneath the surface. So tonight, as we begin moving through this hidden Sahara, try not to picture only dunes, picture layers. Picture a landscape that has worn many faces. Picture people standing beside seasonal lakes under a sky bright with stars. Picture animals moving through grasslands where sand now drifts. Picture workers maintaining underground tunnels in a desert civilization that refused to be simple. Picture someone shaping a stone tool hundreds of thousands of years before modern borders, modern languages, or modern ideas of history. Picture a flash in the sky, a burst of heat, and glass forming in the sand. Picture painted figures on rock walls, silent but not meaningless. Picture the great circular eye of stone in Mauritania, staring upward through geological time. The Sahara has been called empty because much of what it holds is not obvious at first glance. But the same could be said of almost anything worth understanding. A fossil is only a stone until someone recognizes the shape of life inside it. A ruin is only a pile of rock until someone sees the plane of a city. A desert is only empty until someone starts asking what the sand has covered, what the wind has uncovered, and what the earth has been keeping safe in its dry, patient way. And once those questions begin, the Sahara stops being a blank space. It becomes one of the most remarkable historical landscapes on the planet, a place where the deep past is not gone, only quiet. The first secret to understand is that this desert was not always dry. Before the stone circles watched the solstice, before the Garamantes drew water through their tunnels, before the paintings were made and the glass was carried into royal treasure, the Sahara passed through times when rain returned and life spread into places that now seem almost impossible. To see the lost world clearly, we have to begin there, not with sand but with water, with a greener Sahara and with the long climatic rhythm that turned one of Earth's harshest deserts into a landscape of lakes, rivers, animals, and human possibility. To understand the Sahara's lost world, we have to begin with something that feels almost out of place there now. Not sand, not stone, not heat shimmering above the horizon, but rain. Real rain, falling often enough and long enough to change the shape of life across North Africa. It is strange to imagine at first. The modern Sahara is so dry in many regions that years can pass with barely any rainfall at all. There are places where the air itself seems to have forgotten how to hold moisture, where riverbeds lie empty like old roads to nowhere, and where the sun has the confidence of someone who has never once been asked to leave the room. But this was not always the case. The Sahara has moved through cycles, and in some of those cycles it was not the desert we know today. It was greener, wetter, and full of life. If you were able to step back thousands of years, not by a little, but by enough to arrive during one of the Sahara's humid periods, the first surprise might be the sound. Not silence, but water moving, wind passing through grass, birds calling near wetlands, insects humming over reeds, the soft movement of animals at the edges of lakes. You might still see open country, broad skies, and dry stretches here and there, because this was not a rainforest draped across the whole of North Africa. But the overall feeling would be completely different from the Sahara we picture now. There would be grasslands and savannas. There would be seasonal rivers and streams. There would be lakes in basins that are now dry. There would be people living where today survival would require careful planning, satellite navigation, and ideally someone who remembered to pack enough water. This greener Sahara was shaped by changes in Earth's orbit and tilt, the slow celestial mechanics that alter how sunlight reaches different parts of the planet. Over long stretches of time, these changes strengthened the African monsoon and pushed summer rains farther north. The same broad region that is now dominated by aridity received enough moisture to support plants, animals, and human communities. It was not magic, though it can feel like magic when you first learn about it. It was climate responding to astronomical rhythm. The Earth's movement around the sun changed slightly, the distribution of heat shifted, winds and rains followed, and the Sahara became a different place. The planet did not need to invent a new landscape. It simply allowed an older possibility to return. One of the names scientists use for the most recent of these wet phases is the African humid period. It began after the last ice age, roughly around 14,000 years ago in some regions, and reached its fullest expression in the early to middle Holocene, before declining several thousand years later. The dates vary depending on where you are in the Sahara, because a region this enormous does not change like a light being switched on or off. Some areas became wet earlier, some stayed wet longer, some dried gradually. Others seem to have shifted more abruptly, but the broad pattern is clear enough. For thousands of years, parts of the Sahara held far more water than they do today, and that water transformed everything. The evidence is scattered across the desert in ways that feel almost like clues left by a vanished world. There are ancient shorelines visible on the edges of dry basins, marking where lakes once stood. There are sediments laid down in water, now exposed under the desert sun. There are fossil shells from creatures that could not have lived without lakes or wetlands. There are fish bones found far from any modern river. There are pollen grains preserved in old deposits, tiny botanical witnesses that speak of grasses, shrubs and trees. There are carvings and paintings showing animals that belong to wetter environments. And in some places beneath the surface there are buried channels where rivers once ran, detected by satellite images and geological surveys. The Sahara, seen from above and below, begins to reveal the outline of a different world. One of the most dramatic examples was the great expansion of ancient lakes. Lake Chad, which today is much smaller than it once was and has fluctuated greatly even in recent history, had a gigantic predecessor known as Mega Chad. At times, it spread across a huge area, one of the largest lakes on Earth during its high stands. Try to imagine that for a moment. In a region many now associate with dryness and dust, there was once a vast inland lake, broad enough to shape weather, ecosystems and human movement. Its ancient shorelines can still be traced. Its old sediments still hold the memory of water. The lake is not there in the same way anymore, but the land has not entirely forgotten it. Farther west and north, other lakes filled depressions across what are now deserts. Some were permanent for long periods. Others came and went with rainfall and season. The important thing is not that the whole Sahara became one continuous garden, because that would be too simple. The important thing is that water existed in enough places and for enough time to create corridors of life. Animals could move through the landscape. People could follow herds, settle near lakes, fish, gather plants, and later herd cattle. The desert was not a barrier in the way it later became. It was a region of movement, and movement is one of the things that makes human history possible. The animals of the Green Sahara are among the most vivid signs of this lost environment. Elephants moved through parts of it. Giraffes browsed in open woodland and savanna. Antelope grazed across grasslands. Hippos lived in rivers and lakes, which is perhaps one of the clearest signs that we are dealing with a Sahara very different from the modern one. Hippos are not subtle animals. They require substantial water, and they are not known for thriving in dry dunes through positive thinking. Crocodiles too lived in waters that no longer exist at the surface. Fish inhabited lakes and rivers that are now only geological traces. These animals appear not only in bones and environmental evidence, but in human art, carved and painted onto rock by people who saw them as part of their world. There is something quietly powerful about those animal images. A person in the past did not draw a crocodile in the Sahara as a climate diagram. They drew what mattered to them, what they knew, feared, hunted, watched, or understood as part of their living landscape. To us, the images become evidence. To them, they may have been memory, story, ritual, instruction, or simply the result of a skilled hand paying attention. That is one of the strange gifts of archaeology. Practical evidence often arrives wearing the face of human expression. A carved hippo can tell us about water. A painted herd can tell us about grass. A scene of people with cattle can tell us about changing economies, social life, and the way communities adapted as the environment shifted. People have been present in and around the Sahara long before this green period, but the wetter climate opened possibilities. Early Holocene groups moved into areas that had once been too dry or difficult. They lived near lakes, used stone tools, fished, hunted, collected wild grains, and left behind hearths, pottery, bones, and traces of camps. In some places, archaeologists have found evidence of fish being cooked and eaten in regions that today seem far removed from reliable water. It is a reminder that maps can be misleading if we only see them in their modern form. A place that now looks remote may once have been desirable. A dry basin may once have been a lakeside camp. A route that now seems impossible may once have been a practical path between water sources. As the Green Sahara developed, human life changed with it. There were hunter-gatherer communities who made use of rich aquatic resources. Fishing became important in some lake regions. People collected plants and hunted animals across grasslands and wetlands. Later, pastoralism spread, and cattle became central to life in many areas. The image of cattle in Saharan rock art is especially important because cattle require water and grazing. They are not the sort of animals one brings into a hopeless wasteland unless one enjoys very poor planning. Their presence tells us that people were managing herds in landscapes capable of supporting them. Over time, cattle also became socially and symbolically important, appearing again and again in art and archaeological remains. This cattle period in Saharan history is fascinating because it shows the desert not only as an environmental story, but as a cultural one. Herding is not just a way of getting food, it changes movement, settlement, wealth, relationships, and daily routines. People must think about pasture, water, breeding, protection, and seasons. They must decide when to stay and when to move. They must read the land carefully. In a region where rainfall could vary, that knowledge would have been essential. The Green Sahara was generous compared with the later desert, but it was not necessarily predictable. It required attention. It rewarded people who understood timing, routes, weather, animals, and the sky. And this is where the Sahara begins to feel less like a lost paradise, and more like a real lived environment. It was not simply green and easy, it was dynamic. Lakes rose and fell, rainfall shifted, grasslands expanded and retreated. Some places were rich, while others remained dry. People adapted to these variations, and their adaptations left a record. They built camps near water. They made tools suited to their needs. They decorated rocks with images from their world. They buried their dead. They moved through the landscape in ways that connected regions now separated by difficult desert. What looks today like isolation may once have been connection. The idea of a Green Sahara also changes how we think about Africa's ancient human geography. Today, the Sahara is often imagined as a great divider between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, a huge band of deserts separating worlds. But during humid periods, it could act less like a wall and more like a bridge. People, animals, ideas, and technologies could move through it more easily. This does not mean movement was effortless, but it does mean the region was far more open than it later became. The Sahara's changing climate may have influenced patterns of migration and contact over immense stretches of time. In that sense, the desert's past is not a side story. It is part of the larger story of how human populations moved, met, adapted, and changed. It is also worth remembering that the Green Sahara was not a single moment. The desert has gone through wet and dry phases many times, driven by long-term climatic cycles. The most recent green phase is the easiest to connect with archaeology and rock art, but older wet periods existed too. Long before the people of the Holocene lived beside lakes and painted cattle, earlier humans and human relatives moved through North African landscapes that also change with climate. This matters because some of the Sahara's stone tools are astonishingly old, far older than the cattle paintings, older than farming, older than modern civilization by such a large margin that the mind has to slow down to take it in. The environmental story provides the stage for those deeper human traces as well. When scientists reconstruct the Green Sahara, they do not rely on one kind of evidence. They combine many. Lake sediments can reveal when water was present and what kind of environment surrounded it. Fossil pollen can indicate the plants that grew nearby. Isotopes can give clues about rainfall and temperature. Animal remains reveal ecosystems. Archaeological sites show where people lived and what they did. Rock art preserves images of animals, people, and cultural practices. Satellite imagery helps identify buried river systems and ancient shorelines. Each line of evidence has limits, but together they form a picture that is hard to ignore. The Sahara was once alive in ways the modern desert conceals. Of course, the most haunting part of this story is that the green Sahara did not last. Over thousands of years, the orbital conditions shifted again. The monsoon weakened and retreated southward. Rainfall declined, lakes shrank, rivers disappeared from the surface, grasslands thinned, animals moved away or died out locally. People had to respond. Some communities migrated toward the Nile Valley, the Sahel, or remaining water sources. Others changed their ways of life. Pastoral groups adjusted their routes. Settlements were abandoned. The region dried, not always evenly and not everywhere at once, but with consequences that were profound. This drying of the Sahara is one of the great environmental transformations of the Holocene. Imagine living through generations in a landscape that slowly becomes less reliable. A lake your grandparents knew as full becomes smaller. A route once used for herds becomes more difficult. Rain arrives later, or not enough. Grass fails in places where it once returned. Wells and springs become more important. Knowledge becomes more urgent. People do not experience climate change as a graph. They experience it as decisions. Where do we move? When do we leave? Can the animals survive here? Is the water still good? Will the rains return? These are not abstract questions when your life depends on them. In some places, the transition may have felt gradual enough for communities to adapt over time. In others, environmental thresholds may have been crossed more sharply. Once vegetation thins beyond a certain point, bare ground reflects more sunlight, dust increases, and local conditions can reinforce drying. The Sahara did not simply lose rain, it changed as a system. Plants, soils, winds, water, and human choices all became part of the transformation. The result was the spread of the desert conditions we recognize today. Not instantly, not everywhere in the same way, but steadily enough that the lost green world became buried under the identity of the Sahara as a desert. Yet even after the drying, water remained in hidden ways. Some survived in oases, springs, and underground reservoirs. Some remained as fossil groundwater beneath the surface, stored from wetter ages. Some existed as memory in rock art and oral landscapes we can no longer fully recover. Human life did not simply vanish from the Sahara after the Green Period. It adapted to the desert. Trade routes developed. Oasis settlements became vital. Later societies learned to cross, farm, mine, trade, and survive in difficult conditions. But the drying changed the rules. It turned former corridors into obstacles. It made water a treasure. It changed where people could gather, how far animals could travel, and what kinds of societies could flourish. This is why the idea of the Sahara as a time capsule is so useful. The desert that followed the Green Period did not erase everything. In some ways, it helped preserve the evidence of what came before. Dryness protected bones, tools, and art in certain places. Wind exposed old surfaces. Remote regions remained undisturbed. The desert became a cover over the lost world, but not a perfect one. Every so often, the cover slips. A shoreline appears on a satellite image. A rock shelter reveals paintings. A dry basin yields fish bones. A stone tool lies on the surface, waiting for someone to notice that it does not belong to ordinary desert gravel. The Sahara keeps offering small corrections to the idea that nothing happened there. There is also a gentle warning in this history. Landscapes can change so completely that future generations may find it hard to believe what came before. If we had no shorelines, no fossils, no tools, no paintings, the idea of hippos and crocodiles in the Sahara might sound like a myth told by someone who'd spent too long in the sun. But the evidence is there. The Earth has been many Earths. The version we know is only the current arrangement. Deserts can remember rain. Dry valleys can remember rivers. Sand can cover grasslands. Human beings, meanwhile, must live inside these changes without seeing the full pattern until much later. That is one reason the Sahara's past feels so striking. It stretches ordinary human perspective. It shows a place transformed beyond recognition, yet still carrying the signs of its earlier life. When we talk about the Sahara being green, it is tempting to imagine a vanished Eden, a perfect world lost to dryness. But that may make it too simple. The real green Sahara was more interesting than that. It was varied, changing, sometimes abundant, sometimes difficult. It held wetlands, grasslands, lakes and dry zones. It sported animals and people, but it also demanded movement and adaptation. It was not a paradise, it was a living landscape, and because it was living, it was never still. Its rivers shifted, its lakes rose and fell, its communities changed, and its climate moved gradually toward the desert we know. This makes the discoveries across the Sahara feel less like isolated marvels and more like pieces of a long environmental conversation. Nabta Playa's stone arrangements make sense in a world where seasonal change mattered deeply. Rock carvings of water-loving animals make sense when rivers and lakes once crossed the region. Garamantes irrigation makes sense as a later response to a drying land that still held underground reserves. Fossil water beneath the desert makes sense as the hidden inheritance of wetter times. Even the ancient tools scattered across the Sahara remind us that people and earlier humans moved through North Africa under climates very different from today's. The Lost World was not one single discovery. It was the condition that made many discoveries possible. And perhaps this is the most important shift in thinking. The Sahara did not become important only when people crossed it with caravans or when ancient civilizations rose along its edges. It was already important long before that. It was a place of water, animals, human movement, adaptation, and observation. It was part of the deep history of our species and our relatives. It shaped roots, opportunities, and memories. It helped determine where people could live and where they could not. It held the sky above wide-open horizons, and for people living near its lakes and grasslands, that sky would have been more than beautiful. It would have been useful. It told time. It marked seasons. It helped people notice patterns in a world where survival depended on recognizing them. As the humid period matured and communities returned again and again to favored places, some locations became more than temporary stops. They became meaningful landscapes. Water, animals, stone, and sky came together in ways that people marked physically. In southern Egypt, at a place now dry and remote, people arranged stones in patterns that still provoke questions thousands of years later. The land there does not look inviting today, but during wetter times it offered seasonal water and grazing. It was a place where herders could gather, where the return of rains mattered, and where the movements of the sun and stars may have been watched with care. Out of that practical need and that patient attention came one of the Sahara's most intriguing ancient sites, a place where the green desert looked upward and left stones behind to show that it had been reading the heavens. The stones at Nabta Playa do not look dramatic in the way people often expect ancient monuments to look dramatic. They do not rise like pyramids. They do not tower above the desert. They do not carry carved faces, long inscriptions, or the sort of grand entrance that makes a visitor whisper without being sure why. At first, they're almost modest. A scatter of upright slabs and arranged stones on a dry basin in southern Egypt, far out in the desert, where the horizon is wide and the silence has had thousands of years to get comfortable. And yet, the longer you look at them, the stranger they become. Because these stones were placed by people more than 7,000 years ago, at a time when this part of the Sahara was not simply barren ground, but a seasonal landscape shaped by rain, grazing, movement, and sky-watching. Nabta Playa lies west of the Nile in what is now Egypt's western desert, close to the border region with Sudan. Today it is remote and dry, the kind of place that makes you understand why modern fieldwork requires water tanks, vehicles, permits, equipment, and at least one person who knows where everyone left the spare fuel. But in the early Holocene, during the wetter phases of the Sahara, this basin could collect seasonal rainwater. It was not a permanent lake in the grand, glittering sense. It was more like a playa, a shallow basin that filled when rains came and dried when they passed. That may sound unreliable, and in some ways it was, but in the desert, even temporary water can become extremely important. Seasonal water draws animals, animals draw people. People return to places that help them survive. Over time, a landscape like this becomes familiar, meaningful, and worth marking. The people who came to Nabta Playa were not building in isolation from their environment. They were living within a rhythm. Rainy seasons brought water. Water brought grasses. Grasses supported wild animals and later cattle. Groups moved through the region, likely returning when conditions were useful. This was not the Sahara of endless dry dunes that lives in the modern imagination. It was a variable landscape, one that could be generous for part of the year and harsh at other times. The difference between arriving too early, too late, or at just the right moment could matter. And when timing matters, the sky becomes more than scenery. It becomes a calendar overhead. This is where Nabta Playa becomes especially interesting. Among the remains found there are stone arrangements that some researchers have interpreted as having astronomical significance. The most famous is often called a calendar circle, a small arrangement of stones that may have been aligned with the rising sun around the summer solstice. The summer solstice, the longest day of the year in the northern hemisphere, would have occurred near the time when seasonal rains were expected in that region. If the interpretation is correct, then these stones were not simply decorative or random. They may have helped people mark a crucial point in the year, a moment tied not to abstract curiosity but to practical life. Rain, grazing, movement, ceremony, survival. The sun rising in a certain place on the horizon might have carried information people needed. It is worth slowing down here, because ancient astronomy can easily be misunderstood. When we hear that stones align with the sun or stars, it can sound as if we're talking about a full observatory, with ancient scientists in robes taking notes on clipboards, which, given the desert wind, would have been a poor clipboard environment. But early skywatching did not need telescopes, written equations, or modern instruments to be serious. It required patience, memory, careful observation, and a landscape open enough to make horizon points visible. If you watch the sunrise over many months, you notice that it does not rise in the same place every day. It shifts along the horizon, reaching one extreme at the summer solstice and another at the winter solstice. If your community depends on seasonal change, noticing those extremes is not a hobby, it is knowledge. At Nabta Playa, the possible solstice alignment suggests people were paying attention to the regular behaviour of the heavens. The stones may have helped fix that behaviour into place on the ground. This is one of the oldest habits of human culture, taking something that happens in the sky and giving it a mark on earth. A point, a line, a circle, a place to return to. The sky moves, but the stone remains. The season comes and goes, but the marker waits. In that sense, a stone circle is not just a structure. It is a way of making time visible. The site also includes larger stone complexes, alignments, and megalithic features that have been the subject of much debate. Some researchers have proposed that certain stone lines at Nabta Playa may point toward bright stars or constellations, including stars associated with Orion, though these interpretations are not accepted with the same confidence by everyone. That is important. Archaeology is often a careful conversation between evidence and caution. A stone line can look intentional. It can also be affected by erosion, disturbance, or the very human desire to find patterns, which is one of our oldest talents and occasionally one of our most troublesome. The safest way to think about Nabta Playa is not to imagine every stone as a perfectly decoded message from the stars, but to recognise that the site shows repeated deliberate human activity, and that at least some of it appears connected to seasonal and possibly astronomical observation. Even with that caution, the place remains remarkable. The people of Nabta Playa were living thousands of years before the great monuments of dynastic Egypt. They were not leaving behind pyramids, temples, or hieroglyphs, and yet they were organising space, marking the landscape, burying cattle, and possibly tracking the sky. Their world was not simple just because it was early. This is a common trap in thinking about prehistory. We imagine that people without writing were somehow less thoughtful, less observant, or less capable of complex ideas. But writing is not the beginning of intelligence. It is one technology for preserving thought. Long before writing, people were reading tracks, clouds, stars, seasons, animal behaviour, stone and water. They were building knowledge through attention, and attention can be a very powerful tool when your life depends on it. One of the most intriguing aspects of Nabta Playa is the relationship between its ceremonial features and cattle. Archaeologists have found cattle burials there, including remains placed in covered chambers. This suggests that cattle were not merely useful animals. They likely had social, symbolic, or ritual importance. In many pastoral societies, cattle are food, wealth, status, identity, and spiritual symbol all at once. They provide milk, meat, hides, movement, and social value. They can connect families, mark ceremonies, and shape the way people understand prosperity. At Nabta Playa, the burial of cattle in deliberate context hints that these animals occupied a meaningful place in the community's worldview. That matters because cattle also connect the people of Nabta Playa to the changing Sahara. Herding in this environment required seasonal planning. Animals needed water and grazing. People needed to know where and when those resources would appear. A stone marker tied to the summer solstice, if that is what the calendar circle was, would make sense in this pastoral setting. It would not be astronomy separated from daily life. It would be astronomy braided into it. The sky told people when to expect rain, when to move, when the basin might become useful again. The stones made that knowledge durable, not in a written sentence, but in an arrangement that could be seen, remembered, and perhaps taught. Imagine the scene during a wetter phase, The basin at Nabta Playa has collected water. Grasses are growing. Cattle stand near the edges, restless and heavy-bodied. People gather in groups, perhaps seasonally, perhaps for reasons that combine practical need with ritual importance. Children watch adults prepare food, repair tools, tend animals, and point toward the horizon. At dawn, the sun rises in a position that has been watched before. Someone knows this position matters. Someone has learned from older people that this point in the year means something. The stones stand nearby, not as decoration, but as a quiet framework for memory. There is no need to imagine a priest dramatically announcing the solstice while everyone gasps. Though to be fair, humans have always enjoyed a bit of drama when the lighting is good. It may have been calmer than that. A known event, a return, a sign that the seasonal cycle was turning again. In this way, Nabta Playa helps us understand how science, ritual and survival were not always separate categories. Modern minds often divide them neatly. Science goes in one box, religion in another, agriculture in another, art somewhere else, and practical scheduling in a very boring digital calendar that sends reminders at inconvenient moments. But ancient life did not necessarily divide experience that way. Watching the sky could be practical and sacred. Herding cattle could be economic and symbolic. Returning to a seasonal lake could be survival and tradition. Placing stones could mark time, place, memory, and meaning all at once. The same action could do several things, because life itself required several kinds of understanding. The importance of Nabta Playa also lies in its age. When people hear about ancient stone circles, they often think first of Stonehenge in Britain. Stonehenge is famous for good reason, but Nabta Playa is older than Stonehenge by a considerable margin. This does not mean one directly led to the other, and it does not help to turn ancient monuments into a competition, though humans do seem to enjoy ranking everything from mountains to sandwiches. What it does show is that the impulse to arrange stones in relation to landscape, season and sky appeared in different places and deep in prehistory. People across the world found ways to bring the heavens down to earth, using the materials they had and the questions that mattered to them. There is also a possible connection, still debated and handled with care, between the pastoral cultures of the Sahara and later developments in the Nile Valley. Some researchers have suggested that ideas, people, or symbolic practices from the Western Desert may have contributed to the broader cultural background from which ancient Egyptian civilization eventually emerged. This is not a simple straight line, and it should not be treated as one. The formation of ancient Egypt was complex, shaped by the Nile, farming, regional exchange, political organization, and many cultural influences over long periods. But the desert was not cut off from that story. People moved between the Nile and the surrounding regions. As the Sahara dried, groups may have shifted toward the Nile Valley, carrying memories, practices, animals, and ideas with them. Nabta Playa reminds us that the desert was not merely outside civilization, it was part of the wider world from which later civilizations grew. The seasonal environment of Nabta Playa may have made it especially suitable for gathering. In dry regions, water points often become social points. People who might be dispersed across a landscape come together when resources allow. Such gatherings can encourage exchange of tools, food, marriage partners, stories, techniques, and ritual practices. A place like Nabta Playa may have functioned not only as a practical stop but as a meeting ground. If people returned there repeatedly over generations, it could accumulate meaning. Stones might be placed, burials made, alignments observed, traditions repeated. The landscape becomes a record not because someone set out to build a monument for future archaeologists, which would have been thoughtful but unlikely, but because repeated life leaves structure behind. The dry climate that later took hold helped preserve some of this record. Once Nabta Playa became less useful as a seasonal basin, once the rains retreated and people moved elsewhere, the site remained in the desert. Erosion, wind, and time affected it, of course. Nothing sits outside change. But the absence of dense vegetation, later urban construction, or heavy continuous occupation meant that traces could survive. The stones remained. The cattle burials remained, the basin remained. Thousands of years passed, and the landscape became something very different from the one its builders knew. That contrast is part of what makes the site so moving. The stones still stand in a dry place, marking rhythms of a wetter world. There is a particular kind of wonder in discovering that a dry desert basin may hold one of the earliest known examples of people aligning stones with the heavens. It challenges the lazy idea that advanced observation belongs only to settled agricultural societies or cities. Nabta Playa's people were mobile or semi-mobile pastoralists, living in a landscape that demanded flexibility. Their knowledge was not less sophisticated because it was not written down. It was suited to their world. They knew animals, they knew water, they knew stone. They knew the sky well enough, perhaps, to turn it into architecture. That architecture may seem small, but smallness can be misleading. A few stones carefully placed can represent generations of observation. They can embody a community's relationship to place and season. They can mark a point in the year when life shifts. They can serve as memory aids, teaching tools, or ritual centers. We should not measure importance only by height. The desert itself teaches that. A low mound may be a burial. A shallow depression may be an ancient lake. A chipped stone may be evidence of a human presence older than any city. A modest circle of rocks may be one of the first known signs that people in this region were watching the heavens with structured intent. Of course, there are things Nabta Playa does not tell us. It does not tell us the names of the people who built there. It does not tell us exactly what they said while placing stones. It does not preserve their songs, arguments, jokes, or the precise meaning they attach to cattle burials. We cannot know whether a child was bored during a ceremony, whether someone complained about the heat, or whether an elder insisted that the stones had to be arranged just so because apparently every group project in human history has required one person with strong opinions. These ordinary details are lost. Archaeology gives us material traces, not full lives. But even traces are enough to show that something complex was happening. The uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the honesty of looking back. We can say that Nabta Playa was used by people living in a wetter Sahara. We can say they placed stones deliberately. We can say cattle had special importance there. We can say some alignments appear to connect with seasonal or celestial events. We can say the site belongs to a long history of human attention to the sky. But we should leave room for what we do not know. Ancient people did not arrange their lives for our convenience. They did not label their monuments with explanations, which is inconsiderate from a documentary perspective, but understandable. They were living for themselves, not for us. Still, the basic image remains clear enough. In what is now a harsh desert, people gathered in a place of seasonal water and marked the land in stone. They watched the horizon. They followed environmental rhythm. They treated cattle with significance. They returned, built, buried, and remembered. Then the climate changed. The rains declined. The basin dried. The people moved or adapted elsewhere. The stone stayed behind, holding a kind of quiet testimony. Not a full message, not a finished explanation, but enough to tell us that the Sahara's past was richer and more organised than a simple idea of emptiness allows. Nabta Playa also changes how we think about time itself in the desert. The site is more than 7,000 years old, but it points to even older habits, watching seasons, reading the sky, tying human life to environmental cycles. The desert makes those habits visible because it strips things down. In a forest, growth might cover a site. In a city, later construction might bury it deeply. In the Sahara, a few stones on a flat surface can remain exposed to the sky they may once have measured. There is something fitting about that. A place built around horizon and season is still under the same sun. The landscape changed, the climate changed, the people moved on, but dawn still comes. The solstice still returns. The stars still cross the night, though not in exactly the same positions over thousands of years, because even the heavens have their slow motions. Precession, the slow wobble in Earth's axis, means that the stars visible at certain times shift across long spans of time. This makes ancient astronomical interpretation difficult, but also fascinating. A star alignment that worked thousands of years ago may not point to the same star in the same way today. Researchers studying Nabta Playa have to reconstruct ancient skies, not simply stand in the present and point. This is one reason the work is complicated. It requires archaeology, astronomy, geology, and climate science all speaking to each other, preferably without too much academic elbowing. The site belongs to more than one field, because the people who used it were dealing with more than one part of life. Land, sky, animals, water, memory. All of it matters. There is also a human intimacy in the act of skywatching. We often think of astronomy as vast, and it is. Stars are enormous, distant, and cheerfully indifferent to whether we understand them. But the human experience of watching the sky is local. It happens from a particular place, with a particular horizon, in a particular season. Nabta Playa's stones may have connected cosmic regularity to a basin that filled with rain. The universe in that moment was not distant. It was useful. The sun's position could help mark when the rains might come. The stars could help structure memory. The sky was not just above life. It was part of life. This makes Nabta Playa one of the clearest openings into the mind of the Green Sahara. Not because it explains everything, but because it shows people responding thoughtfully to a changing environment. They were not passive figures moving through a simple wilderness. They were observers, herders, builders, and perhaps ritual specialists. They made decisions shaped by rainfall, animals, and celestial cycles. They built in stone not because stone was easy, but because it lasted, and it did last. Long enough for us to sit here thousands of years later, imagining a damp season in a now dry basin and realizing that the desert has been looking back at the sky for a very long time. As the Sahara continued to dry, places like Nabta Playa lost the conditions that had made them useful. Seasonal lakes became rarer, pastures shifted, human communities moved toward more dependable water, especially the Nile Valley and other regions where survival could be organised around remaining resources. But the memory of the wet Sahara did not vanish all at once. It remained in roots, traditions, animal bones, buried water, and art. Across North Africa, on rock faces and cave walls, people left images of the world they knew. Cattle, hunters, giraffes, elephants, hippos, crocodiles, and scenes that make the modern desert look like it is wearing the wrong climate. To follow the story from the stones of Nabta Playa, we have to turn toward those images next, because the Sahara did not only mark the sky, it also carved and painted the animals of its vanished rivers onto stone. Across the Sahara, long after the seasonal waters of places like Nabta Playa had begun to retreat from memory, the rocks kept their own quieter record. Not in words, not in dates, not in the kind of tidy historical explanation that would make things convenient for us, but in images. Animals, people, bodies, boats, cattle, hunters, dancers, strange figures, and scenes of daily life were carved and painted across cliffs, shelters, and exposed stone. Some are faint now, worn by heat, wind, and the long patience of geology. Others still feel surprisingly alive, as if the people who made them had only just stepped away to fetch another pot of pigment and got delayed by several thousand years. And among these images are creatures that seem almost impossible when placed against the modern Sahara. Hippos, crocodiles, elephants, giraffes, antelope, and fish. A whole living world scratched and painted into the desert's memory. This is one of the most direct ways the Sahara tells us it was not always the place we know today. You can explain ancient shorelines with geology, and you should. You can analyse pollen grains, lake sediments and isotopes, and scientists do. But there is a particular force in seeing a crocodile carved into a rock face where the nearest suitable crocodile neighbourhood is now very far away. It makes the old climate feel less abstract. A graph can tell us rainfall increased. A sediment core can tell us a lake existed. But a rock carving of a hippo says, quite plainly, someone saw water here, or near enough to matter. Someone knew this animal. Someone took the time to preserve its shape. The desert, which today can look stripped down to sand and stone, once held enough life for people to make that life into art. Rock art appears in many regions of the Sahara, from Libya and Algeria to Niger, Chad, Egypt, Sudan, and beyond. The styles vary widely because the Sahara is enormous and the art spans thousands of years. It was not made by one group, in one moment, for one reason. It is better to think of it as a vast and uneven visual archive, built by many communities across changing climates and cultures. Some images were engraved by pecking or incising the rock surface. Others were painted with mineral pigments, often reds, browns, whites, yellows, and blacks. Some are tiny and simple. Others are large, detailed, and astonishingly elegant. Many were made in places that were not merely random stone canvases, but meaningful locations, shelters, cliffs, routes, water points, and gathering places. These were landscapes people knew intimately, not empty surfaces waiting to be decorated. In Libya's desert regions, including areas such as the Messac and the Akakas, engravings and paintings show a Sahara filled with animals now absent from those environments. Hippos appear with heavy bodies and rounded forms, unmistakable in their need for water. Crocodiles stretch across stone with long tails and low bodies, ancient shapes from vanished wetlands. Giraffes reach upward with long necks, browsing in landscapes that must once have supported trees or shrubs. Elephants and rhinoceroses also appear in some Saharan art traditions, animals that speak of very different ecological conditions from those that dominate now. These images were not fantasy in the simple sense. Ancient people certainly had imagination, but they also drew from the world around them. The animals shown in the rock art match other evidence for a greener Sahara, and together they form a powerful record of environmental change. There is a temptation to treat these images only as climate evidence, as if every carved animal were a small prehistoric weather report. And yes, they do help reconstruct past environments. But they were not made for us to use in a lecture about rainfall. They were made by people whose reasons we cannot fully recover. Some images may have recorded animals important for hunting. Some may have had ritual meaning. Some may have marked territory, memory, identity, or stories. Some may have been teaching tools, showing younger people animals, events, or practices. Some may have been connected to beliefs about power, fertility, transformation, or the relationship between humans and the non-human world. We should be careful not to flatten them into data points, even while recognizing that they are very useful data points. A hippo carved in the Sahara is evidence of water, but it is also evidence of a human mind paying attention. The scenes involving people can be just as revealing. In some areas, human figures are shown hunting with bows, driving animals, dancing, herding cattle, or standing in groups. Later images often include domestic cattle, sometimes in great numbers, reflecting the importance of pastoral life during and after the greener phases of the Sahara. The cattle are not just background animals, they are central, sometimes carefully drawn, sometimes shown with decorated bodies or in association with human figures. This suggests that cattle were part of social and symbolic life, not merely walking food storage with horns, though that practical aspect was certainly not ignored. In pastoral communities, animals can become part of wealth, ceremony, identity, marriage exchange, and status. Rock art does not give us a manual explaining these meanings, but it shows us that the relationship mattered. The older images of wild animals may belong to what researchers sometimes call the Boobaline period, named after the ancient wild cattle or buffalo-like animals that appear in some engravings, though the dating and classification of Saharan rock art can be complex and debated. Then come phases more associated with pastoralism, when domestic cattle become prominent. Later still, as drying continued and the Sahara became more desert-like, images of horses, chariots and camels appear in various regions. This sequence, in broad strokes, mirrors environmental and cultural change. First, a world rich in wild fauna, then a landscape of herding communities, then a drier Sahara crossed by new forms of transport and trade. The rock art becomes a moving record of transformation, not through written history, but through the changing animals people chose to depict. The presence of hippos and crocodiles is especially important because these animals are tied so closely to water. A giraffe can move through dry country if it has access to browse and seasonal water, but a hippo is a far more demanding witness. Hippos spend much of their time in water to keep cool and protect their skin. They need rivers, lakes or wetlands. Crocodiles too require aquatic habitats. When these animals appear in Saharan art, and when their bones appear in old deposits, they tell us that water was not just a rare puddle in an otherwise empty land. In some areas, it was substantial enough to support stable ecosystems. The Sahara's lost rivers were not metaphors. They were real channels of life. Imagine one of those ancient river margins. The air is warmer than comfortable perhaps, but not empty. Reeds grow near water, birds move in flocks, fish disturb the surface. A crocodile lies half submerged and pretending, as crocodiles do, that it is merely part of the furniture, until something edible makes a poor decision. Hippos gather in deeper pools, noisy, powerful, and not especially interested in anyone's personal space. People approach carefully because water brings life but also danger. The same river that offers fish, plants, and animals also holds teeth. A community living near such a place would know it in detail. When animals came to drink, where the banks were soft, where reeds hid danger, where fish could be caught, where children should not wander. To carve or paint those animals was not to decorate a blank wall, it was to place a familiar power into stone. One of the most extraordinary things about Saharan rock art is how often it captures movement. Giraffes stride, cattle process, hunters draw bows, human figures reach, dance, or run. Even when the art is stylized, it can feel observant. The artist knew the curve of a neck, the slope of a back, the posture of animals in motion. Some engravings are so refined that they suggest long traditions of skill. This is another reminder that the people of the prehistoric Sahara were not vague silhouettes wandering through a primitive background. They had artistic conventions, techniques, choices, and ways of seeing. They represented their world with care. The landscape itself shaped the survival of the art. In the Sahara, rock surfaces can develop a dark desert varnish, a thin coating formed over long periods by mineral and microbial processes. When ancient artists engraved through that darker surface, they exposed lighter rock beneath, creating visible lines. Over time, the exposed parts could darken again, which sometimes helps researchers think about relative age. Paintings, meanwhile, survived where shelter protected them from direct weathering, though many have still faded. Sand, heat, salt, wind, and occasional human damage all take their toll. Some images are now ghostly, others remain bright enough to feel almost intimate. It is a fragile archive, and not all of it will last. There's also the problem of interpretation. A modern viewer might see an image and immediately try to translate it into a story. This person is hunting. That one is dancing. This animal is sacred. That scene is a ritual. Sometimes those interpretations may be reasonable, but we have to remember that the cultural meanings are not always accessible. Rock art is not a picture book with missing captions. It is a record from worlds whose languages, myths, and social structures are mostly unknown to us. We can compare styles, study contexts, date associated materials, examine superimpositions where one image was made over another, and connect the art to environmental evidence. But the full meaning often remains beyond reach. This uncertainty does not make the art less valuable, it makes it more human. Other people lived in the Sahara, saw the world through their own categories, and left marks we can recognize without fully possessing. In some places, the art seems to show boats or watercraft, which adds another layer to the story of water in North Africa. The Nile, of course, has a long history of boats, but images and evidence from Saharan contexts raise questions about movement across lakes and wetlands during wetter periods. If people used watercraft in regions now dry, it would fit with a landscape where lakes and waterways mattered. Again, the Sahara becomes less like an empty divide and more like a network of habitats and routes. Water did not only support animals, it enabled travel, gathering, fishing, and contact. The animals in the rock art also help us feel the emotional distance between past and present. There is something almost melancholy about a painted crocodile in a desert shelter. Not because the ancient artist intended melancholy, but because we see what changed. We know the crocodile is gone from that landscape. We know the water retreated. We know the living context of the image has vanished. The animal remains only as a mark on stone, and the mark has outlasted the ecosystem that made it ordinary. It is a small reversal of expectations. The painting seems fragile, but it survived. The river seemed powerful, but it disappeared. This is one reason the Sahara can feel like a time capsule. The rock art does not simply show isolated animals, it preserves relationships. Humans with animals, animals with water, water with climate, climate with movement, movement with culture. Every image sits inside a larger chain of change. A giraffe engraving is connected to vegetation. Vegetation is connected to rainfall. Rainfall is connected to monsoon systems and orbital cycles. A cattle scene is connected to pastoralism, seasonal planning, social organisation, and perhaps ritual life. A crocodile is connected to lakes and rivers, but also to the danger and abundance of those waters. The art is visual, but the story behind it is ecological and human at the same time. Some Saharan rock art sites became famous because of their density and beauty. Tassili Najia in Algeria holds thousands of images and will draw us into stranger territory later, especially with the so-called roundhead figures. The Tadrata Carcass in Libya is another extraordinary region, with paintings and engravings that document environmental and cultural change over thousands of years. The Enedi Plateau in Chad, the Air Mountains in Niger, and many other regions hold their own records. Each place has its own styles and histories, but together they reveal that prehistoric life in the Sahara was widespread, varied, and deeply connected to changing conditions. One of the practical questions scientists ask is how to date the art. This is not always easy. Paintings may contain organic material that can sometimes be dated, but often the pigments are mineral and difficult to assign absolute dates to directly. Engravings are even trickier. Researchers may date associated archaeological layers, compare patination, study overlapping images, or link certain subjects to known environmental or cultural phases. If an image shows domestic cattle, for example, it cannot be older than the introduction of cattle in that region. If it shows camels, it belongs to a much later period in Saharan history. But exact dating remains difficult in many cases. The art often speaks in sequences rather than precise years, which is slightly rude of it, but fairly common for ancient stone. Still, the broad story is strong. During wetter periods, people depicted wild animals associated with savanna, woodland and water. As pastoralism spread, cattle became prominent. As aridity increased and long-distance desert travel changed, horses and later camels appeared. The changing subjects of the art are like a slow visual migration through time. The Sahara's walls become a gallery of adaptation. The shift toward cattle imagery also tells us something about changing human priorities. When wild animals dominated the landscape, people made them central in art. As domestic herds became central to life, cattle took on greater visual importance. This does not mean wild animals vanished immediately, or that all groups changed in the same way. The Sahara was too large for one simple pattern. But it does suggest a transition from hunting and foraging lifeways toward pastoral economies in many regions. Herding allowed people to live in environments where wild resources could be seasonal or unpredictable, but it also tied them to the needs of their animals. Cattle require water, they require pasture, they require protection. Human life became organized around their movement and care. As the Sahara dried, this relationship became more difficult. The rock art, in some places, may preserve a kind of record of stress and adjustment. Cattle groups had to follow shrinking zones of pasture. Water points became more important. Some communities moved toward the Nile, the Sahel, or mountain refuges where moisture lasted longer. Others adapted to desert life in new ways. Eventually, camels would become crucial to trans-Saharan movement, but that came much later. Before the camel became the great symbol of desert travel, the Sahara had already seen thousands of years of humans moving through greener and then drying landscapes, leaving marks on stone as they went. The images of crocodiles and hippos also remind us that the boundaries of animal worlds can change dramatically. Today, we think of species distributions as if they belong naturally to certain places, but those patterns are historically fluid. Animals follow habitat. When habitat shifts, their ranges shift. During wet phases, corridors opened. During dry phases, populations retreated, fragmented, or vanished locally. The Sahara's old rock art catches animals at moments when their ranges extended into places where they no longer survive. In that sense, the carvings are not only art or archaeology. They are records of biogeography, the changing geography of life. There is another layer too. The people who made these images experienced the animals directly, but perhaps they also experienced their disappearance over generations. Imagine a community whose elders remember more water than the young have ever seen. Imagine stories about animals that no longer appear as often. Imagine a lake shrinking, a herd route failing, a crocodile pool drying. Rock art may preserve not just what was present, but what was important enough to remember. Some images could have been made at times when certain animals were still common. Others might have captured animals already becoming rare in a changing world. We cannot always tell, but the possibility gives the art a deeper emotional texture. It may be record, reverence, memory, or all three. For modern people, one of the challenges is to avoid seeing the Sahara's past as a simple before and after picture. First green, then desert. The drying was uneven. Some highlands and sheltered regions retained moisture longer. Some lakes persisted while others vanished. Oases remained. Human groups adapted at different speeds and in different ways. Rock art reflects that complexity. Images from different phases can appear on the same surfaces, sometimes overlapping. A later camel may cross near an older giraffe. A cattle scene may sit beside wild animals. The stone becomes a layered conversation between different Saharas, each one leaving marks over the last. This layering is part of what makes the art so valuable. It shows that people return to meaningful places across long periods. A rock wall was not necessarily used once and forgotten. It could be visited repeatedly, becoming a kind of memory surface. New groups may have seen old images and added their own. They may have understood the older marks differently from the people who made them. They may have respected them, reused them, ignored them, or placed new images right over them. In that way, the rock face itself became a landscape of time, with different generations sharing the same stone without sharing the same world. The Sahara's rock art also complicates our idea of who ancient desert people were. They were not simply survivors of harshness. They were artists, observers, herders, hunters, travellers and storytellers. They had time and reason to make images. They had pigments, tools, techniques and traditions. They lived in social worlds rich enough to produce shared symbols, and they understood animals with a closeness most modern people do not. To draw an animal well, you have to look at it carefully. To live near it, hunt it, herd it, fear it, or depend on it, you have to know its habits. The art is full of that attention. When we look at the painted memory of the lost Sahara, we're also looking at a form of human response to change. The environment shifted, but people did not merely vanish from the story. They watched, moved, adapted, marked, remembered. Their images became part of the desert's long afterlife. The rivers dried, but the crocodiles remained on stone. The wetlands vanished, but the hippos stayed in outline. The grasslands retreated, but giraffes still walk across rock walls. It is not the same as survival in the biological sense, but it is a kind of cultural persistence. The animals are gone from the landscape, yet still present in the archive of human attention. And so, the Sahara's rock art leads us from water to memory, from ecology to culture, and from vanished animals to the people who understood them. But as the land continued to dry, memory alone was not enough. Communities had to find ways to live with increasing aridity, and some of those ways became astonishingly ambitious. In the central Sahara, long after the wettest ages had passed, one society learned to draw ancient water from beneath the desert itself. They built towns, farmed oases, traded across great distances, and cut tunnels through the ground to carry hidden water toward their fields. The painted animals show us the Sahara that was once wet on the surface. The Garamantes show us what people did when much of that water had gone underground. By the time the Sahara became drier, the old world of lakes and crocodiles had not vanished completely. It had changed form. Water that once moved across the surface in rivers, pools and seasonal wetlands became harder to find. But some of it remained hidden underground, stored in ancient aquifers like a quiet inheritance from wetter ages. This is where the story of the Garamantes begins to feel almost impossible at first. Not because they lived in the Sahara, since people have always found ways to live in difficult places, but because they built an urban society in the central Sahara, without depending on a great river like the Nile. They did not have a broad, reliable river valley doing the obvious work for them. They had desert, rock, buried water, engineering, labour, trade, and a very clear understanding that if water would not come politely to the surface, then someone would have to go and get it. The Garamantes lived in the Fedzan region of what is now southwestern Libya, especially around the Wadi al-Ajal, a long depression bordered by desert escarpments. Today, this landscape can look severe, with dry ground, scattered oases, and a sense of distance that makes every settlement feel like an achievement. But in antiquity, this region supported towns, farms, cemeteries, forts, and routes of exchange. The Garamantes were known to Greek and Roman writers, though those writers did not always understand them very well. From the Mediterranean point of view, people living deep in the Sahara were easy to describe as strange, distant, or troublesome. Ancient outsiders often reduced them to raiders, desert tribes, or exotic figures at the edge of the known world. Archaeology has shown something more interesting. The Garamantes were not simply wandering through the desert. They organized it, they farmed it, they engineered it. They built a society around water that was almost invisible from above. Archaeological research in Fedzan has documented extensive Garamantean settlement and irrigation, including Fagara systems in the Wadi al-Ajal, with hundreds of channels identified and recent studies estimating about 750 kilometers of underground tunnels and access shafts in that region. Their capital, usually identified with Garama near modern Jerma, was not a tiny camp clinging nervously to survival. It was a town with surrounding settlements, cemeteries, mud brick architecture, and links to wider trade networks. There were houses, fields, tombs, and social organisation. There were imported goods from the Roman world, evidence of contact across immense distances, and signs of local wealth and hierarchy. The Garamantes sat between worlds, Mediterranean North Africa to the north, sub-Saharan regions to the south, and the harsh, open desert all around. In that position, they became participants in trade across the Sahara long before the better-known medieval caravan networks. Goods, people, animals, ideas and technologies moved through their world. The desert was not empty space between civilizations. It was a difficult but active landscape, and the Garamantes knew how to use it. But the centre of their achievement was water. More specifically, water that had accumulated underground during earlier wet periods, when the Sahara received more rain and aquifers were replenished. By the time the Garamantes rose to prominence, much of that water was no longer being replaced quickly. It was fossil water, ancient groundwater stored beneath the desert. To reach it, the Garamantes used underground irrigation channels known as fagaras, similar in principle to qanat systems found in other arid parts of the world. The idea is simple enough to explain and extremely difficult to build. A gently sloping tunnel is dug underground, reaching into a water-bearing layer. Because the tunnel slopes downward toward fields or settlements, gravity carries the water along without the need for pumps. Vertical shafts are dug at intervals from the surface down to the tunnel, allowing workers to remove spoil, enter for maintenance, and keep the system open. From above, the shafts can appear as lines of holes or mounds across the desert, like dotted lines drawn by someone with very patient hands and a deep dislike of easy projects. The genius of the system is that it protects water from evaporation. In a hot desert, open canals lose water quickly to the air. Underground tunnels keep the flow shaded and cooler until it reaches the fields. It is elegant in principle, but it requires enormous effort. People had to identify where groundwater could be reached, dig through hard ground, maintain the correct slope, clear collapses, repair channels, organise labour, and distribute water fairly enough that the society did not immediately dissolve into arguments, which is difficult enough even when the plumbing is modern. These were not casual ditches. They were infrastructure. They represented planning, authority, skill, and a long-term commitment to place. The Fogaras made farming possible in a region where rainfall alone could not support dense settlement. With water from underground, the Garamantes could irrigate fields and gardens. They grew crops such as wheat and barley, and likely cultivated dates, grapes, figs, and other plants suited to oasis agriculture. Fields in the desert are not simply patches of green. They are statements of control over water. Every plant growing under irrigation represents a chain of decisions: where to dig, how to channel, when to release, who maintains, who harvests, who owns, who pays, who benefits. The Garamantes turned hidden water into food, and food into towns, labour systems, trade and political power. It is easy to romanticize this, and to be fair, underground cities of water in the Sahara do sound like something from a very ambitious adventure film. But the reality would have been hard. Digging for garas was dangerous and exhausting. Tunnels could collapse, air could be poor. Air. Workers had to remove tons of earth and stone through narrow shafts. Maintaining the channels was continuous work because sand, sediment and damage could block the flow. Some researchers have suggested that enslaved labour may have played a significant role, especially given ancient accounts of Garamantian raiding and the scale of the work required. We should not turn the Garamantes into a cosy miracle of sustainability without acknowledging that large irrigation systems often depend on social inequality and heavy labour. The desert engineering was remarkable, but it was not effortless, and it was probably not gentle for everyone involved. The Garamantes also challenge a familiar way of thinking about civilization. We often picture ancient cities growing beside rivers: the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River. Rivers provide water, transport, silt, fish, and predictable agricultural rhythms. The Garamantes did something different. They built an urban society in a major desert without a permanent river at its centre. Their river was underground, slow, hidden and ancient. They did not live beside it. They mined it. This makes their achievement both impressive and precarious. A surface river renews itself if the climate and watershed allow. Fossil groundwater does not renew on the same time scale. Once the Garamantes began drawing heavily from it, they were using a stored resource. The past was feeding the present, but only for a while. That phrase, "for a while," is important. The Garamantian system flourished for centuries, but it had limits. As water tables dropped, fogaras had to be extended farther or dug deeper to keep reaching groundwater. That meant more labour for less return. Eventually, the balance between effort and water must have become harder to maintain. If the water level fell below the tunnel intake, the channel would stop flowing. A society built around gravity-fed fossil water could not simply wish the aquifer higher. It could dig again, reorganise, shift fields, or reduce demand, but the basic physics remained unmoved. Gravity is very helpful until the water is no longer where you need it to be. This creates a story that feels strangely modern. The Garamantes were not using fossil fuels, but they were using a fossil resource, groundwater from older climates. Their success depended on tapping a reserve that was not being replenished at the same rate. That does not make them foolish. It makes them human. People use what is available, especially when the alternative is leaving or shrinking. The Garamantes found water beneath the desert and built a society around it. For generations it worked. Fields grew, towns expanded, trade moved. Then the resource became harder to access, and the system became more difficult to sustain. The lesson is not that ancient people failed because they were short-sighted. The lesson is that environments have limits, and even brilliant engineering must negotiate with them. Their location made them powerful in other ways too. The Fezzan sat along routes connecting the Mediterranean world with sub-Saharan Africa. The Garamantes could control, tax, protect, raid, or participate in movement across the desert. They likely traded in goods such as dates, salt, metals, textiles, animals, and possibly enslaved people. Roman goods found in Garamantian contexts show that they were not isolated from the Mediterranean economy. Glassware, pottery, and other imported materials travelled south, while goods from deeper Africa could move north. The Sahara, often imagined as a blank barrier, functioned here as a network. Difficult, yes. Dangerous, certainly, but not empty. Routes were knowledge, and knowledge of routes could become wealth. Horses and chariots appear in rock art and ancient descriptions connected with Saharan peoples, including the Garamantes. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the Garamantes in terms that included horse-drawn chariots and pursuit of cave-dwelling peoples, though ancient authors must always be read carefully. They mixed observation, rumour, geography, and imagination with great confidence, rather like certain relatives explaining a news story they only half heard. Still, the references suggest that the Garamantes were known as mobile and formidable people in the desert. Later Roman writers also mention them, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as remote desert powers. From the Roman viewpoint, the Garamantes could appear as troublesome people beyond full imperial control. From the archaeological viewpoint, they look like something broader. Farmers, engineers, traders, builders, and political actors in their own right. Their tombs tell part of the story. Garamantian cemeteries contain different burial forms, including pyramid-like tombs, shaft burials, and more elaborate monuments for higher status individuals. Tombs are never just about death. They are about society. Who receives labour after death? Who is remembered visibly? What objects are placed with the dead? What kind of ancestry or status is being claimed? In the Garamantian world, the cemeteries suggest hierarchy and organised social life. They show that this was not a temporary scattering of desert camps, but a society with durable communities and complex relationships. The farms themselves would have been striking against the surrounding desert. Imagine walking toward an oasis settlement after crossing dry ground. At first, perhaps only a line of palms appears, slightly blurred by heat. Then fields come into view, green squares and strips fed by channels. Date palms rise above lower crops, creating shade and a layered agricultural space. Mud brick houses stand near the cultivated areas. People move between fields, wells, storage areas, animals and workshops. Beneath the ground, unseen, water travels through tunnels cut by earlier labour. The entire settlement depends on a hidden system that must keep flowing. It is not hard to understand why water would have shaped power. Whoever organised, controlled, or maintained the flow-controlled life. The phrase underground cities of water is not meant to suggest that the Garamantes lived in tunnels like sleepy desert moles. They lived in towns and villages on the surface, but below them lay the infrastructure that made those towns possible. The real city, in a sense, had two layers. Above ground were houses, fields, roads, tombs, and markets. Underground were the arteries. The fagaras were like buried veins carrying old water into living spaces. Without them, the surface world would shrink. With them, the Garamantes could create an island of agriculture in a region that otherwise demanded movement. This layered world also helps explain why archaeology changed the reputation of the Garamantes so dramatically. For a long time, many accounts leaned heavily on Greek and Roman texts. Those texts were valuable, but they saw the Garamantes from outside and often through prejudice. Archaeological surveys, excavations, satellite imagery, and landscape studies revealed the scale of settlement and irrigation. Suddenly the Garamantes were not just a footnote at the edge of classical history, they were central to the history of the Sahara itself. Their civilization showed that desert societies could be urban, innovative, and connected. It forced historians to take the interior Sahara seriously as a place of development, rather than merely a zone between better documented regions. There is a quiet correction in that. Written history often privileges people who left texts, especially texts preserved in places later scholars studied closely. The Garamantes left far fewer written records of their own, so outsiders spoke for them. Archaeology gives them back some of their complexity. A tunnel is an argument, a cemetery is an argument, a field system is an argument. Together they say, this was organised, this was substantial, this mattered. The desert did not need to be described by outsiders to have a history. It was making history in mud brick, water channels and trade routes all along. The rise of the Garamantes also belongs to the longer story of the Sahara's drying. After the Green Sahara faded, surface water became rarer, but underground reserves remained in places. The Garamantes learned to exploit those reserves at scale. In a way, they lived between two climatic realities. Their surface environment was arid, but their water came from a wetter past. Every crop grown by Sahara irrigation was nourished by the memory of ancient rainfall. That is a remarkable thought. The fields of the Garamantes were not simply products of their own time, they were the delayed harvest of an earlier Sahara. Eventually, however, this system declined. The exact causes are complex and debated, as they usually are when a society changes over centuries rather than politely leaving behind a note. Falling groundwater levels likely played a major role. Political shifts, changing trade routes, labour demands, conflict, and broader regional transformations may also have contributed. As fogaras dried or became too difficult to maintain, agricultural production would have suffered. Without enough water, the towns could not support the same population or wealth. The infrastructure that once made the desert bloom became harder to sustain. The underground river weakened, and the surface city followed. Yet the Garamantes did not simply vanish into nothing. Descendant communities, later oasis societies, and continuing Saharan trade all carried parts of the region's history forward. But the height of Garamantian power passed. Their towns became ruins, their fields dried, their tunnels fell silent or were reused, altered and forgotten in places. From above, the desert resumed its appearance of emptiness. But beneath the surface, the lines remained. Shafts, tunnels, settlement mounds, cemeteries, and field systems continue to mark the land. The Garamantes left a pattern in the Sahara that modern archaeology could learn to read. This is one of the recurring surprises of the desert. It hides by simplifying the surface. A ruined mud brick wall may melt back into earth until it looks like a low mound. A field system may disappear unless viewed from the air. A fagara may survive only as a line of shaft openings across barren ground. To an untrained eye, it may look like nothing much. To an archaeologist, it can be the outline of an entire economy. The Sahara's evidence often requires the right scale. Stand too close, and you see stones and dust. Step back, sometimes with aerial photography or satellite imagery, and a system appears. The Garamantes remind us that lost worlds are not always lost because they were destroyed in a single dramatic moment. Sometimes they end because maintenance becomes harder, water drops lower, routes shift, and the conditions that once held a society together slowly loosen. There is no need for a single thunderclap. History often changes by accumulation. A tunnel dries, a field is abandoned, a family moves, a market shrinks. A road is used less often, a town becomes smaller. Generations later, the place is a ruin, and much later still, someone calls the desert empty. But empty is the wrong word. The Garamantian landscape is full of effort. Every shaft cut into the ground represents work, every channel represents planning. Every settlement represents households, meals, repairs, arguments, children, animals, and the ordinary repetition that makes a society real. It is easy to admire the engineering from a distance, but the people matter too. Someone climbed down those shafts. Someone cleared the tunnels. Someone opened and closed channels. Someone watched the fields for signs of stress. Someone traded dates or grain. Someone repaired a wall after a storm. Someone buried their dead under the desert sky. The Garamantes were not an irrigation system with people attached. They were people who used irrigation to build lives in a hard place. Their story also shows how the Sahara links the very ancient to the more recent past. The Green Sahara left groundwater. Later societies drew upon it. Rock art recorded animals and herders. Garamantian farms continued the pastoral and agricultural story under drier conditions. Trade routes connected desert communities to Mediterranean and sub-Saharan worlds. The Sahara was never just a backdrop. It was an active participant, offering and withholding water, preserving roots in some periods and closing them in others, forcing human beings to adapt again and again. There is something almost intimate about the idea of water moving underground beneath a desert city. Above, the heat, the dust, the brightness, the appearance of scarcity. Below, a slow hidden flow. The Garamantes understood that the visible landscape was not the whole landscape. They looked beneath it and found possibility. That habit, looking beyond the obvious surface, is exactly what the Sahara itself asks of us. The desert may look empty, but its emptiness is often a disguise made by time. As we leave the fields and tunnels of the Garamantes, the story begins to move even deeper, beyond ancient towns and irrigation, beyond cattle herders and rock painters, into a past so old that it reaches before modern humans as we know ourselves. The Sahara's dry surfaces do not only preserve the ruins of desert kingdoms, they also hold stone tools shaped hundreds of thousands of years ago, from periods when North Africa was crossed by earlier human populations, and perhaps by human relatives whose names we may never know. Long before the Garamantes cut water from the ground, long before artists painted crocodiles, long before Nabta Playa watched the solstice, someone stood in a very different Sahara, selected a stone, struck it with skill, and left behind a tool that would outlast nearly everything else. A stone tool can be easy to overlook. It does not shine like gold, stand upright like a monument, or announce itself with the confidence of a temple wall. It may sit on the desert surface looking to an untrained eye, like one more broken rock among many broken rocks, which is rather unfair considering it may be older than cities, older than farming, older than language as we know it, and older perhaps than our own species in its modern form. The Sahara is full of such quiet things, tools shaped by hands so ancient that we cannot always say exactly whose hands they were. Not the hands of kings, builders, scribes, or named individuals, but of people or human relatives, living so far back in time that history has not yet begun to speak. They left no writing, no houses we can easily recognize, no myths we can retell. They left stone. This is where the Sahara's lost world becomes much older than the green landscapes of hippos and cattle herders. The rock art showed us a Sahara that was wet enough for crocodiles, rich enough for giraffes, and familiar enough to ancient artists that they carved and painted its animals into memory. The Garamantes showed us a later desert society drawing hidden water from beneath the ground with astonishing effort. But beneath those stories is another, deeper one. The story of early humans and their relatives moving through North Africa across changing climates, carrying tools, making choices, and adapting to environments that shifted between wet opportunity and dry isolation. The Sahara was not always a barrier. At times, it was a corridor. At other times, it became a filter. And scattered across its surface are the stone tools that show just how long this region has mattered. Stone tools survive because stone is patient. Wood rots, skin decays, plant fibers vanish, bone can disappear unless conditions are kind. But stone, once shaped, can remain for hundreds of thousands of years, especially in dry places. It can be moved, buried, exposed, polished by wind, chipped again by accident, and still hold the marks of human intention. That is the crucial word, intention. A naturally broken rock and a deliberately shaped tool may seem similar at first, but archaeologists learn to recognize the difference. They look at the angle of flakes, the pattern of strikes, the shape of cutting edges, the way one blow prepared for another. A tool is not just a sharp rock. It is a decision preserved in mineral form. In parts of the Sahara and North Africa, stone tools have been found that date back hundreds of thousands of years. Some are associated with what archaeologists call the Acheulean tradition, famous for large hand axes and cleavers shaped with repeated, controlled flaking. These tools appear across Africa and far beyond it, and they are often connected with earlier human species such as Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, or related populations. The names can become a little slippery because human evolution is not a tidy ladder, with each species politely waiting its turn before the next arrives. It is more like a branching, overlapping family gathering where several relatives look suspiciously similar, nobody brought enough labels, and the older guests left very few photographs. But the important point is this: some Saharan tools were made long before the worlds of rock art, herding, farming, or cities. Some may be around 400,000 years old, placing them in a time when modern humans, Homo sapiens as we recognise ourselves, were either not yet present in their fully modern form or only beginning to emerge elsewhere in Africa. That number, 400,000 years, is difficult to feel. We can say it easily, but the mind tends to smooth it over. 400,000 years ago is not ancient in the way the pyramids are ancient. It is not ancient in the way the first farmers are ancient. It is an older kind of old, a depth of time where ice ages came and went, coastlines changed, species shifted, and the Sahara itself passed through very different climates. To place it in perspective, the oldest pyramids are less than 5,000 years old. The green Sahara of the early Holocene was mostly within the last 12,000 years. A 400,000-year-old tool pushes us far beyond all of that. It belongs to a world where the people making it were not thinking about kingdoms, calendars, or written names. They were thinking about stone, food, movement, danger, and the immediate problems of living. What did such a tool do? That depends on the tool. Some were hand axes, carefully shaped on both sides into teardrop or oval forms. These could cut, butcher, dig, scrape or work plant materials. Some were flakes struck from prepared cores, sharp pieces used for cutting meat, hide, wood or other materials. Later technologies became more refined, with prepared core methods allowing tool makers to control the size and shape of flakes more precisely. But even the older tools show planning. A good hand axe is not random. It requires understanding how stone fractures. It requires choosing suitable raw material. It requires holding a shape in mind while removing flakes in sequence. That does not mean the maker thought about geometry in a modern classroom sense, which is probably for the best, since no one should have to learn geometry while also keeping an eye out for large predators. But it does mean the maker possessed skill, memory, and learned technique. The Sahara's stone tools also tell us something about movement. Early humans and their relatives did not stay fixed in one small place forever. They followed resources, climates, animals, and opportunities. North Africa, including what is now desert, likely played an important role in movements within Africa and possibly beyond it. During wetter periods, grasslands, lakes, and rivers created habitable corridors. During drier periods, those corridors narrowed or closed. A region that today looks like a vast obstacle may once have been a landscape people could cross, inhabit, and use. The tools are signs of presence in those windows of possibility. They tell us that when the Sahara opened, people entered. It is useful to imagine not one Sahara, but many Saharas layered through time. A dry Sahara, with dunes and bare rock. A wet Sahara, with lakes and animals. A cold or cooler Sahara during different global climate stages. A Sahara of scattered refugees where water remained. A Sahara crossed by groups whose bodies, technologies, and ways of life changed across hundreds of millennia. A tool found on the surface may not come with a scene attached, but it belongs to one of these Saharas. It was made in a world with weather, animals, plants, other people, and choices. The challenge is reconstructing that world from what survived. Archaeologists working in desert landscapes face particular difficulties. In caves or deeply buried sites, layers can build up over time, preserving a sequence like pages in a book. In open desert settings, evidence can be more exposed, disturbed, or scattered. Wind can remove sediments. Water, when it comes in rare but powerful bursts, can move artifacts. Surface finds may be hard to date directly, because they are no longer sealed in clear layers. A stone tool sitting in the open desert may be ancient, but figuring out exactly how ancient requires careful context. dating of nearby deposits, analysis of surface weathering, or association with sediments and landforms. The Sahara gives clues, but it does not always hand over its schedule. Still, when patterns emerge across many sites, they become powerful. Tools appear near old lake margins, ancient river systems, and raw material sources. They show that early humans understood where to find good stone and where to find food. They returned to favourable areas. They used landscapes that later became inhospitable. Some sites preserve dense concentrations of tools, suggesting repeated activity or locations where stone was worked heavily. Other finds are sparse, the faint trace of a passing group. Both matter. A dense scatter tells of activity. A single flake may tell of movement. There is something striking about the idea of a tool lying in the desert for hundreds of thousands of years. The maker held it briefly compared with its later existence. Perhaps it was used for minutes, days, or weeks, then dropped, lost, broken, or abandoned. The hand that made it vanished. The group moved on. Generations passed, then species, climates, and landscapes changed. The tool remained. It outlasted bodies, voices, camps, and probably every story ever told about the day it was made. That is the strange imbalance of archaeology. The least emotional object can become the longest memory. A stone flake knows nothing, but it remembers better than almost anything living. When we say these tools may be older than us, we are stepping into the complicated story of human evolution. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, with early fossils showing our species emerging by around 300,000 years ago, though the full picture is still being refined as new discoveries appear. But before and alongside early Homo sapiens, other human forms lived across Africa. They walked upright, made tools, hunted or scavenged, used fire in some contexts, and adapted to varied environments. They were not almost human in the dismissive sense. They were human relatives, close enough that their lives belonged to our extended story, even if they were not exactly us. The Sahara's older tools may have been made by these populations, or by early members of our own lineage, depending on time and place. In many cases, without fossils directly associated with the tools, we cannot be certain. Stone can tell us what was done, but not always who did it. This uncertainty can be frustrating, but it also keeps the story honest. The Sahara does not present a neat family tree with little arrows and helpful portraits. It offers tools, sediments, fossils in some regions, and environmental clues. From these, scientists build cautious interpretations. A hand axe may indicate a technological tradition shared across wide areas. A prepared core may show a shift in planning and technique. A tool assemblage may suggest how groups processed animals or plants, but the makers remain mostly anonymous. They are close enough to touch through their work, and too far away to name. The tools also show that intelligence did not suddenly arrive with modern civilization, or even with modern humans. The ability to select stone, plan removals, shape symmetrical forms, teach techniques, and carry tools across landscapes goes very deep. A well-made Acheulean hand axe can be beautiful in a plain, functional way. Some are so carefully shaped that researchers have debated whether they carried social or aesthetic meaning beyond practical use. Were they only tools? Were some displays of skill? Did making a symmetrical object matter to the maker or the group? We do not know, but we do know that these objects required attention and competence. They were not accidents. It is also possible that many more ancient materials were used and simply did not survive. Wood would have been useful for spears, digging sticks, handles, and containers. Plants could have been used for fibres, bedding, or food processing. Hides, bones, and shells may have served many purposes, but in many open desert contexts, stone is what remains. This can make ancient lives look more stone-centered than they were. In reality, early humans likely lived in a world of perishable materials. They knew plants, animal behaviour, water sources, weather, fire, and roots. Stone tools were one part of a broader toolkit, but they are the part most willing to stay behind for several 100,000 years without complaining. The changing Sahara shaped where these early populations could live. During humid phases, lakes and rivers would have supported animals and vegetation, creating opportunities for hunting, foraging, and movement. During dry phases, groups may have withdrawn to refuges, the Nile Valley, mountain regions, coastal areas, or scattered water sources. This pulsing pattern may have affected not only survival, but also contact between populations. Wet phases could connect groups across North Africa, dry phases could isolate them. Over long periods, such cycles may have influenced cultural change, genetic exchange, and migration routes. The Sahara was not just scenery, it was a gate that opened and closed. A dry landscape can preserve tools, but a wet landscape often made their use possible in the first place. This is one of the contradictions of Saharan prehistory. The desert we see now helps expose and protect evidence, yet much of that evidence belongs to times when the region was less desert. A tool lying under today's sun may have been made beside a lake, on a grassy plain, or near a river channel. The modern setting can mislead us unless we remember that the land has changed. This is why scientists combine archaeology with paleoclimate research. The tool tells us people were there. The sediments and fossils help tell us what there was like. Some of the ancient tools found in North African desert regions belong to technologies that were widespread across enormous areas. That raises questions about how knowledge travelled. Did groups carry techniques with them as they moved? Did similar problems lead to similar solutions? Did different populations learn from one another? Probably some combination of these things. A stone tool tradition is not exactly a language, but it is a learned behaviour. People do not instinctively produce complex tools the way spiders instinctively spin webs. They must learn by watching, practicing, and correcting mistakes. Every tool, therefore, implies some kind of social world. Someone knew how, someone else may have learned. Skills passed through hands before they passed into stone. Mistakes are part of that record too. Not every tool is perfect. Some cores were abandoned after bad fractures, some flakes came off wrong, some pieces broke during manufacture. These failures can be as informative as finished tools because they show process. They show the steps, the problems, and sometimes the learning. There is something reassuring about that. Even hundreds of thousands of years ago, someone may have struck a stone, watched it break the wrong way, and experienced the ancient version of, well, that was not what I meant to do. Human frustration may not fossilize, but failed flakes come close. The Sahara's older tools also stand apart from the later, more visible signs of human symbolism, such as rock art and ritual structures. They come from times when symbolic evidence is rarer or harder to identify. That does not mean the makers lacked inner lives. It means the surviving record is different. A hand axe does not tell us what someone believed about the sky. A flake tool does not tell us whether someone told stories at night. But it does show practical intelligence, and practical intelligence is not a small thing. Before humans painted caves, built monuments, or wrote down kings' names, they had to solve the daily problems of living in bodies that needed food, water, warmth, and safety. Stone tools are the record of those solutions. There may have been moments in the ancient Sahara when early people stood near water and watched animals gather, much as later artists would. But instead of painting them, they shaped tools to process meat, cut hides, or work wood. They may have scavenged from predator kills in some periods, hunted in others, gathered plant foods, cracked bones for marrow, and carried useful stone from one place to another. The details vary across time, but the general picture is of adaptable populations taking advantage of shifting environments. They were not masters of the landscape in the later agricultural sense. They were skilled participants in it. When we hold these tools in mind, the phrase empty sands becomes almost absurd. The sands may be empty of buildings, they may be empty of crowds, they may seem empty of story because the people are gone and the traces are sparse. But they are not empty of time. A desert surface can hold evidence older than most places people normally call ancient. It can hold a stone struck before our species had fully become itself. It can hold proof that North Africa was part of the long experiment of human survival, movement, and adaptation. The silence of the Sahara is not absence, it is distance. There is also a humbling scale difference between the stone toolmakers and the civilizations that came later. The Garamantes built tunnels that may survive for centuries or millennia. Ancient Egyptians built pyramids that still dominate the imagination. Rock artists left images that speak across thousands of years. But early toolmakers worked across hundreds of thousands of years, generation after generation, with technologies that changed slowly but persisted because they worked. A hand axe tradition lasting immense spans of time is not a sign of dullness. It is a sign that a successful solution can remain useful for longer than entire civilizations last. Modern people update phones every few years and call it progress. A good stone tool design could endure for ages. There is a lesson there, though perhaps not one the phone companies would enjoy. The distribution of ancient tools across the Sahara also reminds us that much remains undiscovered or poorly understood. Large areas are difficult to survey because of remoteness, political instability, harsh conditions, and the sheer scale of the desert. Some sites may already be damaged by erosion, collection, or development. Others remain hidden beneath sand. New technologies such as satellite imagery, remote sensing, and improved dating methods continue to change what researchers can find and understand. The Sahara is far from fully read. Its archive is too large, too scattered, and too complex for any simple account. This means every ancient tool is both evidence and invitation. It tells us someone was there, but it also asks what the world looked like when they stood there. Was the air wetter? Was there a lake nearby? Were they part of a small moving group? Were they butchering an animal, shaping a core, teaching a younger person, or simply preparing for a journey? Did they know this place well, or were they passing through? Archaeology cannot always answer these questions, but asking them helps restore life to the object. A tool is not only a thing, it is a moment of behaviour that survived, and behaviour is what links us, however cautiously, to those ancient makers. We also choose materials, we also learn techniques, we also carry tools, we also adapt to environments we did not design. The difference is one of technology, scale, and time, not the basic fact of problem solving. When an early human struck a flake from a core, they were doing something recognizable, shaping the world slightly to meet a need. That simple act runs through human history all the way to irrigation tunnels, astronomical stone circles, painted caves, and eventually the devices glowing beside modern beds at night, probably far too close to our faces for ideal sleep. As the Sahara dried and changed over the ages, many of these early traces were left behind on surfaces that later people may have crossed without noticing. A Garamantian traveller might have passed near tools already hundreds of thousands of years old. A rock artist might have walked over ancient flakes without recognising their age. A modern researcher may pick up one of those stones and suddenly connect multiple Saharas at once. The wet Sahara that allowed life, the dry Sahara that preserved the object, the human Sahara of movement and adaptation, and the scientific Sahara of careful reconstruction. The object is small, but the timescale is enormous. The deeper we go into the Sahara's past, the more it becomes clear that the desert is not only preserving lost civilizations or vanished animals, it is preserving the prehistory of human becoming. Before the great cities, before the cattle herders, before the stone circles, before the cave paintings, there were tool makers. Their world is harder to picture because they left fewer expressive traces, but it is no less important. They were part of the long African story from which we eventually emerged. Their tools are reminders that human history does not begin with writing, or farming, or monuments. It begins much earlier, with movement, adaptation, and hands learning how to turn stone into an edge. And yet, stone tools are not the only strange objects the Sahara has kept from deep time. Some things lying in the desert were not shaped by human hands at all, at least not at first. In the Libyan desert, scattered across remote sands, there are pieces of natural glass the colour of pale honey and greenish sunlight. They were formed by heat so intense that ordinary fire could not explain it, perhaps when a cosmic body exploded or struck with enough force to melt the surface of the desert itself. Much later, humans found that glass, valued it, shaped it, and carried it into one of the most famous tombs ever discovered. So from the stone tools of ancient hands, the story turns toward a different kind of artifact, one born not from human skill, but from fire falling out of the sky. Out in the western desert of Egypt, near the borderlands of Libya, there are pieces of glass scattered through the sand. Not bottle glass, not pottery glaze, not fragments from some forgotten settlement, but natural glass, pale yellow to greenish, sometimes clear like honey, sometimes cloudy, sometimes full of tiny bubbles and mineral traces. It lies in one of the driest and most remote parts of the Sahara, in a landscape where ordinary life feels sparse and slow, and yet the glass itself was born from one of the most violent events the desert has ever preserved. Libyan desert glass formed roughly 29 million years ago, long before humans, long before the Sahara's green periods, long before cattle herders, stone circles, paintings, cities or kings. Its origin is still discussed in terms of impact and airburst models, but researchers found high-pressure mineral evidence supporting a meteorite impact origin. The first thing to understand is that this glass should not really be there in any ordinary sense. Sand can become glass, of course, but not simply by lying under a hot sun. Even the Sahara, confident though it may be, cannot bake silica into glass by normal afternoon enthusiasm. To melt quartz-rich sand and rock, you need extreme temperatures, far above anything produced by ordinary desert heat. Libyan desert glass appears to have formed when silica-rich material was heated so intensely that it fused, flowed, cooled, and hardened into glass. Some studies describe temperatures exceeding about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the inside of many volcanic environments, which is a slightly excessive way for the universe to make a shiny object. For a long time, scientists debated exactly what caused that heat. One idea was that a meteorite or comet struck the region, releasing enormous energy at the surface. Another was that a large cosmic body exploded in the atmosphere, an airburst, radiating enough heat downward to melt the desert without leaving a clear crater. This second idea appealed partly because no obvious impact crater has been found in the immediate glass field. It is a reasonable puzzle. If something struck the Earth hard enough to melt a large area of desert, where is the hole? The Sahara is not shy about showing large circular structures when it has them, as the Rechat structure reminds us. But with Libyan desert glass, the crater question remains difficult. Erosion, burial, the angle of impact, or a non-crater forming event have all been considered. The absence of an easy crater does not erase the evidence of extraordinary heat. It only makes the event harder to reconstruct. The impact interpretation became stronger when researchers found evidence in zircon grains within Libyan desert glass that pointed to high-pressure shock. Zircon is a tough mineral, a tiny survivor that can record conditions other minerals might not. Under extreme shock pressures, zircon can transform into rhyodite, a high-pressure form associated with meteorite impacts. Later it may revert, but its crystal structure can preserve traces of that transformation. Finding signs of former rhyodite matters because an airburst can produce enormous heat, but high-pressure shock is more characteristic of an actual impact. In other words, the glass does not merely say, something hot happened, it may also say, something hit very hard. Still, the story is not as simple as imagining a neat asteroid falling straight down, making a perfect crater, melting sand, and leaving behind glass like spilled candy. Large impact events are messy. Energy spreads unevenly. Material vaporizes, melts, flies, mixes, cools, and lands in complicated ways. The original surface may be gone. Later erosion may have removed evidence. The glass itself may have been transported or redistributed across the desert by wind and time. Scientists have to work backward from scattered fragments, mineral inclusions, chemical composition, and regional geology. It is a little like trying to reconstruct a thunderstorm from a single raindrop, except the raindrop is 29 million years old and made of glass. What makes Libyan desert glass especially beautiful is that it combines cosmic violence with stillness. The event that formed it may have lasted moments, a flash, a shock, a blast of heat, a surface briefly turned molten, then cooling, then silence, millions of years of silence. The glass lay in the desert as climates changed above it. The Sahara was not even the Sahara in the same way for most of that time. Continents shifted in climate, animals evolved and disappeared, early primates changed, human ancestors eventually emerged elsewhere in Africa. The region passed through wetter and drier phases. Rivers came and vanished, lakes filled and dried. People arrived, moved, made tools, painted rocks, watched stars, built tunnels and formed societies. All the while, pieces of this ancient glass remained in the sand, waiting to be noticed. There is something strange about holding such a material in the imagination. It is not a fossil, because it was never alive. It is not a human artifact at first, because no person made it. It is not volcanic glass in the usual sense, like obsidian formed from lava. It is an impact-related natural glass, born from silica, melted by an extraterrestrial event. And yet later, humans treated it very much like a precious material. They collected it, shaped it, and gave it meaning. A thing made by cosmic accident became part of human culture. The universe dropped a mystery into the desert, and much later someone looked at it and thought, quite sensibly, that it would make an excellent jewel. The most famous human use of Libyan desert glass appears in the treasures of Tutankhamun. Among the objects found in his tomb was a pectoral, an elaborate chest ornament, with a central scarab carved from a canary yellow material identified as Libyan desert glass. The scarab sits within a composition of gold, coloured inlays and Egyptian symbolism, transformed from desert glass into royal ornament. Think about that journey for a moment. A cosmic event melts desert material 29 million years ago. The resulting glass survives in remote sands. Ancient Egyptians, or people connected to Egyptian trade and resource networks, acquire it. A craftsman carves it into a scarab, a symbol associated with rebirth and the rising sun. It is set into jewellery for a pharaoh. Then the tomb is sealed, hidden, and rediscovered in the 20th century, carrying the glass back into human attention. That is not just a chain of events. It is a very long conversation between geology, chance, craftsmanship, and belief. The scarab symbol itself makes the choice of material feel even more fitting. In ancient Egypt, the scarab beetle was connected with renewal, transformation, and the sun's daily rebirth. The beetle rolling a ball of dung was associated with the sun moving across the sky, which is not the most glamorous image until you remember that ancient symbolism often had a practical relationship with nature. A scarab carved from Libyan desert glass, a material born from intense heat and light, seems almost too perfect. The Egyptians may not have known its cosmic origin, but they certainly recognized its unusual beauty. Its golden colour would have suited solar meaning. A stone made by fire from the sky became an image of the sun's return. Sometimes symbolism gets lucky. How did the glass reach Egyptian artisans? That question leads us back into the Sahara as a landscape of movement. The glass field lies far out in the western desert, in a region difficult to reach even today. Ancient people were capable desert travellers, but journeys into such remote areas required knowledge, planning and purpose. It is possible that pieces of the glass were collected during expeditions or through exchange networks that connected desert regions with the Nile Valley. Ancient Egypt was not sealed inside the green ribbon of the Nile. Egyptians and neighbouring desert peoples interacted with surrounding deserts for minerals, stones, roots, animals and trade. The desert was dangerous, but it was also a source of valued materials. Gold, copper, turquoise, carnelian, amethyst and other stones entered Egyptian art and ritual life from difficult landscapes. Libyan desert glass fits into that broader pattern of the desert as both barrier and treasury. The glass would have stood out. In a world without modern plastics, synthetic gems or polished industrial materials, a translucent yellow-green glass lying naturally in the sand would be remarkable. Some pieces are large enough to be shaped, others are small, irregular, pitted or weathered. The best pieces can be carved and polished into luminous objects. The ancient artisan who shaped Tutankhamun's scarab was not merely using a strange stone. They were working with a fragile, rare material that required skill. Glass can chip, that can fracture unpredictably. Turning it into a scarab form meant understanding both the material and the symbolic object being made. The final result is not just beautiful because of what it is made from, but because human hands turned a desert accident into meaning. There is an interesting contrast between Libyan desert glass and the stone tools we just considered. Stone tools are human intention imposed on natural material. Someone chose a stone and shaped it for use. Libyan desert glass begins as natural transformation without human involvement. No early person caused the impact. No ancient craftsperson melted the Sahara. But later humans still entered the story by selecting and shaping it. The glass therefore belongs to two histories at once. Its first history is geological and cosmic. Its second history is archaeological and cultural. It is both a product of deep time and a human artifact, depending on which stage of its life you're looking at. The desert itself helped preserve it. In wetter regions, glass may weather, break down, be buried, or chemically altered more quickly. The hyper-arid conditions of the western desert allowed fragments to remain exposed or shallowly buried for immense periods. Wind polished and abraded some pieces. Sand shifted around them. The glass field became a natural scatter across the landscape, waiting for discovery. Modern expeditions have collected and studied pieces, though there are now concerns about over-collection and damage to the natural context. That is often the fate of beautiful rare things. Once people learn they exist, everyone suddenly becomes very interested in putting one on a shelf. The problem is that a glass fragment in its original landscape tells a story that a souvenir cannot fully carry. Scientifically, Libyan desert glass helps researchers understand impact processes on Earth. Impact events are not merely dramatic scenes from science fiction. They are part of planetary history. Earth has been struck many times, though erosion, plate tectonics, sedimentation, and weather often erase or hide the evidence. Other bodies in the solar system, such as the Moon and Mars, preserve craters more openly because their surfaces are less active in the same way. On Earth, impact evidence can be subtle. Shocked minerals, unusual glasses, geochemical signatures, and buried structures may be needed to confirm what happened. Libyan desert glass is important because it sits at the edge of a debate about how large cosmic events deposit energy, through impacts, airbursts, or combinations of processes. Understanding that difference matters not only for ancient geology, but for assessing hazards from near-Earth objects today. This is one of those moments when the Sahara's past touches the present in a practical way. Studying a glass formed millions of years ago can help scientists think about what happens when asteroids or comets encounter Earth. Modern examples such as Tunguska in 1908 and Chelyabinsk in 2013 showed that airbursts can release enormous energy in the atmosphere, damaging forests, buildings, and people without creating a classic crater. Larger events are rarer, but their consequences could be severe. Libyan desert glass may record an event far more energetic than those modern examples. The desert in this case is not merely preserving a curiosity, it is preserving evidence of a planetary hazard. At the same time, we should be careful not to make the story too tidy. The science is detailed, and the exact formation scenario is still refined as researchers examine mineral evidence, chemistry, distribution, and regional geology. Popular accounts sometimes leap straight to certainty, because certainty is comfortable and makes for good headlines. The real work is slower. It asks what minerals are present, what pressures they record, whether the glass contains meteoritic components, how it was distributed, why there is no obvious crater, and how the event compares with known impact and airburst processes. The answer may be more complicated than a single sentence. The Sahara is rarely kind to simple explanations, but for the purpose of understanding the lost world hidden in the desert, the essential point is clear. Libyan desert glass is evidence that the Sahara preserves events far older and stranger than human history. It is a natural archive of cosmic violence, lying in a landscape that later became an archive of human adaptation. The same desert that holds cattle paintings and irrigation tunnels also holds glass formed before apes had even begun their long road toward humanity. That overlap of timescales is what makes the Sahara so extraordinary. A person can stand in one region and be surrounded, not visibly all at once, but materially, by traces from 29 million years ago, 400,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, and 3,000 years ago. The desert collapses time into objects. There is also a sensory side to the glass that is worth imagining. A piece of Libyan desert glass in the hand can look warm even when it is cool. Its colour ranges from pale lemon to deep yellow, sometimes with greenish tones, sometimes smoky or milky. It may contain bubbles, streaks, inclusions and flow textures from its molten past. It is light in the way glass is light, but heavy with origin. It does not look like a catastrophe. It looks calm. That is one of geology's little tricks. The most violent processes can leave behind objects of great stillness. A volcano makes obsidian smooth enough for mirrors and blades. Pressure makes diamonds. An impact makes glass that later becomes a scarab on a king's chest. The Earth is very good at turning disasters into materials. The human response to such materials is equally old. People notice unusual stones. They carry them. They trade them. They give them meanings. A rare material can become precious not only because it is beautiful, but because it is distant, difficult to obtain, and unlike ordinary things. In ancient Egypt, materials often carried symbolic value tied to colour, source, and transformation. Gold suggested the flesh of the gods and the brilliance of the sun. Blue and green stones could suggest water, vegetation, rebirth, and protection. A yellow glass from the deep desert would not simply be pretty. It could be made to fit a whole language of sacred materials. Even if its true origin was unknown, its appearance and rarity gave it power. This raises a gentle question about knowledge. Did ancient Egyptians wonder where the glass came from? Almost certainly, in some practical sense. They knew it came from the desert, from a particular remote region or through particular routes. Did they know it was formed by a cosmic event millions of years earlier? No, not in scientific terms, but people do not need modern science to recognize wonder. A material can be mysterious without being misunderstood in any foolish way. To an ancient craftsperson, Libyan desert glass may have been desert stone, solar stone, rare glass, sacred material, or simply a beautiful substance worthy of royal use. Modern science adds a new layer to that meaning. It does not erase the older one. The scarab in Tutankhamun's pectoral therefore becomes a meeting point. On one side, deep time, an impact or shock event, molten silica, cooling glass, desert preservation. On the other, human culture, royal burial, solar symbolism, skilled carving, goldwork, ritual protection. Between them lies the Sahara, not as empty space but as the carrier. The desert held the glass until humans found it. The tomb held the scarab until modern archaeologists found it. The object passed from cosmic accident to ancient craftsmanship to modern museum study, gathering interpretations at every step. That is one of the remarkable patterns in this larger journey. The Sahara keeps producing objects that force us to widen the frame. Nabta Playa forces us to think about early sky watching before the pyramids. Rock art forces us to imagine a wet Sahara full of animals. Garamantes tunnels force us to see urban life in the desert. Stone tools force us back before modern humans. Libyan desert glass forces us beyond humanity altogether, into planetary events and extraterrestrial violence. Each discovery pushes the Sahara farther away from the idea of emptiness. It becomes not one lost world, but many, stacked in time. And perhaps that is why this glass feels so compelling. It is not just rare, it is misplaced in the best possible way. We expect deserts to preserve bones, tools, ruins, and dry traces of human survival. We do not necessarily expect them to preserve sunlight-coloured glass from an ancient impact, later carved for a pharaoh. It is the kind of object that makes the Earth feel less ordinary, not because it breaks the rules of nature, but because it follows rules we rarely think about in daily life. Orbital paths, shock pressures, melting temperatures, mineral transformations, erosion rates, trade routes, burial rituals, archaeological rediscovery. The object is small. The system behind it is enormous. As the night settles around this story, it is worth picturing the glass field not during the event itself, but long after. A quiet desert plain, wind moving low over sand and gravel. The sun rising and catching a pale yellow fragment half buried near the surface. No one there to see it for millions of years. Then, eventually, human footsteps. Someone notices the strange material. Someone bends down. A hand lifts a piece made by an event older than any human hand. In that moment, without knowing the full science, the person connects with deep time. They carry the glass away, and the desert secret begins moving through human history. Yet not all of the Sahara's mysteries are made by impacts, tools, tunnels, or animals. Some are painted onto stone in forms that are harder to explain, not because they require wild answers, but because their meanings belong to people whose inner worlds are mostly lost to us. In the high plateaus and rock shelters of Tassili Naja, figures appear with rounded heads, strange bodies, and an atmosphere unlike the animal scenes that speak so clearly of rivers and grasslands. They have inspired careful scholarship, bold speculation, and more than a few ideas that wander off without packing a map. To follow the Sahara's hidden world further, we move from glass made by fire in the sky to images made by human hands in the stone shadows of Algeria, where the round-head figures still stare out from a past we can see but not fully enter. In the sandstone highlands of southern Algeria, the Sahara changes character again. The dunes give way to plateaus, cliffs, arches, narrow passages and rock shelters, a whole stone landscape weathered into shapes that can feel almost architectural. This is Tassili Naja, a vast region at the edge of the central Sahara, and it holds one of the richest collections of prehistoric rock art anywhere on Earth. More than 15,000 drawings and engravings have been recorded there, and UNESCO describes them as evidence for climate change, wildlife migrations, and human life at the edge of the Sahara across immense stretches of time. The place is not only beautiful in the ordinary scenic sense, though it certainly is that. It is beautiful because its stone walls have become an archive. People came here again and again, across different climates and cultural periods, and they left images behind. Some of those images are easy to place within the story we have already been following. There are animals from wetter times, there are cattle scenes from pastoral life, there are hunters, herders, and figures moving through activities that feel connected to everyday survival. But among the most famous and puzzling images of Tassili are the so-called round-head figures. They are human-like, but not always comfortably human. They have large rounded heads, often with little or no facial detail. Their bodies can look soft, floating, swollen, elongated, or strangely weightless. Some appear alone, others appear in groups. Some are small, while others are large enough to dominate the rock surface. They do not look like ordinary portraits. They look like beings caught between human form, mask, ritual costume, and something we no longer have the cultural key to unlock. This is where the Sahara's lost world becomes difficult in a different way. When we see a crocodile painted in the desert, we can say, with reasonable confidence, that water once mattered there. When we see cattle, we can talk about herding and seasonal movement. When we see a Sahara tunnel, we can talk about irrigation. But when we see a round-head figure with a featureless face and a body that seems to hover on the rock, the meaning is not so direct. It does not hand us a simple environmental clue. It asks us to think about belief, ceremony, imagination, identity, and ways of seeing the world that did not survive in writing. These figures are not mysterious because they must be impossible. They are mysterious because they are human, and human meaning is not always preserved just because pigment survives. The name round head is a modern label, of course. The people who painted these figures did not call them that. They may not have thought of them as a single category at all. The label comes from the recurring style: rounded, often featureless heads, sometimes attached to bodies that are simplified, exaggerated, or shown in unusual poses. In some examples, the heads seem helmet-like. In others, they look like masks. Some bodies appear to be decorated with dots, patterns, or lines. Some figures have arms lifted or spread. Some are associated with animals, smaller human figures, or scenes that may suggest ritual performance. UNESCO's publication on the art of Tassili describes the presence of totem animals, masked men, and ritual dances among these painted scenes, which is about as close as we can safely get to saying that many of these images seem connected to ceremony rather than ordinary daily portraiture. It is very tempting when faced with images like these to rush toward dramatic explanations. People have done that many times. Some have suggested that the roundhead figures look like astronauts, helmets, or beings from beyond Earth. This is not surprising. Modern eyes bring modern images with them. Once you have seen a spacesuit, a round-headed prehistoric figure can suddenly seem to be wearing one, especially if you are already in the mood for a mystery. But that does not mean the ancient artist was painting a visitor from another planet. It means our brains are excellent at matching unfamiliar shapes to familiar ideas. A person in the 20th or 21st century sees a helmet. A person in the early Holocene may have seen a mask, a spirit, an ancestor, a transformed human, a ritual performer, or something belonging to a belief system we cannot reconstruct. The safer explanation is not always the duller one. In this case, the human explanation is already fascinating enough. The roundhead figures probably belong to an early phase of Tassili painting, before the more familiar cattle scenes became dominant. They're usually connected with hunter-gatherer communities living in a Sahara that was much wetter than it is today. The climate was not a fixed paradise, and the art was not made all at once, but this was a period when parts of the region could support far more life than the modern desert suggests. The people making these paintings lived in a landscape of animals, seasonal resources, shelters, and water sources. They were not isolated dreamers inventing strange beings in a blank wilderness. They were communities with knowledge, movement, and social worlds, using rock shelters and cliff surfaces as places where images could be made and seen. Some of the roundhead paintings are large enough to suggest public importance. A tiny sketch hidden in a corner may be personal, casual, or experimental, though even that is only a guess. But a figure several meters high on a rock wall requires planning, effort, visibility, and probably a reason for being there. Pigment had to be gathered or prepared. The surface had to be chosen. The image had to be applied, perhaps in stages. Other people may have watched or participated. This was not the same kind of effort as casually doodling on a notebook while pretending to listen during a meeting. It was a deliberate act in a meaningful place. The rock shelters of Tassili would have offered more than protection from sun and wind. They would have shaped sound, shade, movement, and attention. A painting in a shelter is not just an image on stone, it is part of a setting. A person approaching it sees it from certain angles. Light changes it during the day, shadows hide and reveal parts of it. A large figure painted in such a place may have been encountered during gatherings, ceremonies, teaching moments, or seasonal returns. We cannot say exactly how, but we can say that location matters. These images were placed in landscapes people used, remembered, and returned to. Many roundhead figures seem to resist gravity in their style. They do not always stand solidly on a ground line. Some appear to float or expand across the wall. Their limbs may be simplified, their bodies lacking the weight and detail seen in later cattle or human scenes. This has led some researchers and viewers to think about trance, altered states, ritual transformation, or spiritual imagery. That is possible, though difficult to prove. Many cultures use masks, body paint, dance, and altered states in ritual practice. A figure with a round, featureless head could represent a masked person, or it could represent a non-human being, or it could represent a human transformed during ceremony, or it could be part of a visual tradition whose rules are no longer clear to us. The honest answer is that we do not know. But we can recognize that these figures probably meant more than ordinary bodies. One famous image from Tassili, often called the running-horned woman, is not exactly the same as the most featureless roundhead figures, but it belongs to the broader world of Tassili's early painted traditions and gives a sense of how complex the imagery can be. It shows a dynamic female figure with horns, body decoration and movement, sometimes interpreted in connection with ritual or symbolic meaning. Smart history dates the painting broadly to around 6000 to 4000 BCE, though rock art dating remains difficult and often depends on style, context and associated evidence rather than simple direct measurement. The image reminds us that these ancient artists were capable of far more than recording animals. They represented bodies as meaningful, decorated, active, and perhaps sacred. The dating of Saharan rock art is one of the reasons interpretation remains cautious. Pigments are not always easy to date directly. Some painted surfaces have flaked, weathered, or been contaminated. Sometimes researchers rely on fallen fragments, sediment layers, style comparisons, or relationships between images. If one painting lies beneath another, it is older than the painting on top, but that still may not tell us the exact year. This means that the Roundhead period is often described in broad ranges rather than precise dates. The figures belong to a deep prehistoric window, but the boundaries are not as neat as a museum label might make them appear. The past rarely files its paperwork properly. Even so, the sequence at Tassili tells a powerful story. Earlier imagery includes wild animals and strange human-like forms. Later, cattle become prominent, reflecting the rise of pastoral life in a changing Sahara. Later still, horses, chariots, and camels appear, marking new technologies, drier conditions and changing routes. Tassili is not one frozen moment. It is a wall-sized timeline of environmental and cultural transformation. The round-head figures stand near the earlier part of that timeline, before the Sahara became dominated by the desert conditions we imagine today, and before cattle scenes began to organise so much of the visual record. What might these figures have meant to the people who painted them? We can think through possibilities without pretending to solve them. They may have been spirit beings connected to hunting, fertility, initiation, death, healing, or seasonal renewal. They may have represented masked dancers or ritual specialists. They may have shown mythic ancestors or powerful presences encountered in stories. They may have been part of ceremonies held in shelters at certain times of year. They may have served as visual anchors for group identity, marking places where people returned and recognized shared beliefs. None of these possibilities requires us to invent visitors from another world. Human cultures are quite capable of producing strange, powerful, and unfamiliar images all by themselves. We have been doing it for as long as we have had walls, pigment, and something important to express. The featureless faces are especially intriguing. A face gives individuality. It lets us read emotion, age, sex, and intention. When a face is removed or simplified, the figure becomes less like a person you might meet and more like a category, role, or presence. Masks work this way in many cultures. They can hide the individual and reveal something else: an ancestor, animal, spirit, social role, or ceremonial identity. A round-head figure may therefore not be faceless because the artist lacked skill. It may be faceless because the face was not the point. The body may have been transformed into something beyond ordinary identity. Body decoration may also matter. Dots, bands, patterns, and unusual outlines appear in some Tassili figures. These could represent paint on skin, clothing, ornaments, scars, symbolic markings, or artistic conventions. In societies without written texts, the body often carries social information: age, status, gender, group identity, ritual state, or role in ceremony. A painted body in rock art may be a body made meaningful. We should not assume that a simple shape means simple thought. Sometimes a simplified image carries a great deal of cultural information, if you know how to read it. Unfortunately, we're arriving several thousand years late and without the handbook. Animals in the roundhead scenes can also appear in unusual relationships with human-like figures. Some are naturalistic. Others seem symbolic. Mouflon, antelope, and other wild creatures appear in the wider art of the region. The relationship between humans and animals in hunter-gatherer societies is often deeply layered. Animals are food, danger, companions in the landscape, subjects of story, and sometimes spiritual partners or powers. A large, strange figure near smaller humans or animals may not simply show scale in the ordinary sense. It may show importance. Rock art often plays with size to show status, force, or meaning rather than physical measurement. A giant figure may be giant because it mattered. There is also the matter of preservation and modern discovery. Tassili's art became widely known outside the region in the 20th century, especially through expeditions that copied and publicised the paintings. Some of that early work brought global attention to the site, but it also raised problems. Techniques used in the past to brighten, wet, trace, or reproduce paintings could damage them. Modern archaeology and conservation are much more aware of the need to protect fragile surfaces. Rock art is not renewable. Once a pigment layer is damaged, the loss is permanent. The images have survived thousands of years of desert weather, only to face new threats from tourism, touching, vandalism, climate effects, and even well-meaning study. The ancient artists made the work, but we are now responsible for not ruining it, which is a modest expectation and one humanity should try very hard to meet. The roundhead figures are often described as enigmatic, and that word is fair as long as we do not use it as an excuse to stop thinking carefully. An enigma is not an invitation to believe anything at all. It is an invitation to respect the limits of evidence. We can say the figures are prehistoric. We can place them within the broader sequence of Saharan rock art. We can connect them to a wetter environment and to hunter-gatherer communities. We can observe their forms, sizes, locations, pigments, and relationships with other images. We can compare them cautiously with ritual art in other cultures, while remembering that comparison is not proof. What we cannot do is translate them as if they were a sentence in a known language. They are visible, but not fully readable. That partial readability is part of their power. When you look at ordinary scenes of cattle or hunting, you may feel that you understand more than you actually do because the subject is familiar. A cow looks like a cow. A hunter looks like a hunter. But the roundhead figures refuse that easy comfort. They make the distance between us and the ancient artists obvious. They remind us that prehistoric people had inner worlds as complex as ours, but not identical to ours. They had categories we do not have, stories we do not know, and ceremonies we cannot reconstruct from pigment alone. The images show us that the lost Sahara was not only green, populated, and technologically resourceful. It was also mentally and spiritually rich. This is important because ancient people are often reduced to survival. We ask what they ate, where they found water, how they hunted, what tools they used. These are essential questions, but they are not enough. People do not live by calories alone, even though calories are very useful and tend to be appreciated around dinner. Human beings also make meaning. They decorate bodies, tell stories, mark places, honour the dead, fear unseen powers, celebrate animals, teach children, and create images that outlast them. Tassili's roundhead figures are evidence of that deeper life. They show that the Sahara's prehistoric communities were not merely responding to climate, they were building worlds of meaning within it. The landscape of Tassili may have helped shape that meaning. Sandstone formations create natural shelters, corridors, towers, and walls. Some places feel enclosed, others open suddenly to broad views. In a wetter Sahara, these highlands may have held water longer than surrounding lowlands, making them refuges for plants, animals, and people. A rock shelter with paintings could be near a route, a campsite, a water source, or a seasonal gathering place. Over time, the same shelter could gather images from different periods, layering memory on memory. A roundhead figure might have been ancient already when later pastoralists painted cattle nearby. Imagine standing before a wall where earlier beings hover above later herds, where one culture's sacred or symbolic forms remain visible to another culture, living in a changed environment. The stone becomes a meeting place for people separated by centuries or millennia. This layering can also confuse interpretation, because later viewers, including ancient later viewers, may have understood older images differently from their makers. A pastoral group seeing older roundhead figures might have treated them as ancestral, sacred, strange, irrelevant, or simply part of the landscape. They may have painted near them because the place was already meaningful. Or they may have had no idea what the older figures meant and added their own images anyway, in the grand human tradition of leaving marks where other people have already left marks. The result is a record that is not a single message but a long conversation across time. There is a quiet humility in admitting that we cannot fully enter that conversation. We can stand at the edge of it. We can hear a few tones. We can recognise repeated shapes and changing styles. But the language is mostly gone. This is not failure. It is the reality of deep prehistory. The figures remain valuable precisely because they show us something we cannot reduce. They are not just illustrations of climate or economy. They are reminders that the past contained entire systems of thought that disappeared without written explanation. And yet, even without translation, the roundhead figures fit beautifully into the larger story of the Sahara as a hidden world. They belong to the same broad pattern of revelation. The desert looks empty, then gives us animals from vanished rivers. It looks lifeless, then gives us cities watered from underground. It looks timeless, then gives us tools older than modern humans. It looks ordinary, then gives us glass from cosmic fire. And now, in Tassili, it gives us images that suggest ceremony, imagination, and belief. The Sahara was not only a physical landscape, it was a cultural landscape, filled with places that mattered because people made them matter. As drying continued, the world that produced the roundhead figures changed. Pastoral scenes became more common. Cattle moved across stone walls. Later horses and camels appeared. The images shifted as livelihoods and environment shifted. But the roundhead figures remained beneath or beside these later worlds, their strange form still visible. They became part of the desert's long memory. A memory not of facts in the modern sense, but of presence. Someone was here, someone painted this. Someone saw the human body, or something beyond the human body in this way. When we think of Tassili at night, it is easy to picture the painted shelters after sunset, the rock cooling, the sky opening over the plateau. A fire, perhaps, though we should not place one too close to the paintings, for conservation reasons and because ancient smoke is quite enough. People gathered in a shelter, shadows moving across the walls. The painted figures might have looked different by flickering light, less flat, more active. A rounded head could emerge from darkness and disappear again. A painted body could seem to move as flames shifted. If these images were connected to ritual, then the setting itself may have played a role. Rock, light, voice, movement and image could work together. The painting was not necessarily a passive object. It may have been part of an experience. Modern viewers often meet the figures through photographs, books, screens, or museum reproductions, which can make them seem isolated. But they were made in place. Their meaning, whatever it was, belonged partly to the shelter, the route, the season, and the people who gathered there. That is why protecting the sites matters. Remove the image from its landscape, even in imagination, and something is lost. The roundhead figures are not only designs, they are traces of human engagement with a specific Sahara, a wetter, changing, inhabited, meaningful Sahara. By now, the desert has shown us many kinds of hidden evidence: stones aligned with the sky, animals from vanished rivers, tunnels carrying ancient water, tools from deep human time, glass born from cosmic heat, and painted figures whose meanings remain just beyond reach. But one of the Sahara's greatest secrets is not on the rock surface at all. It lies beneath the sand and stone, stored in underground reservoirs from the wet ages that made so much of this story possible. Some of that water fell as rain tens of thousands of years ago, filtered downward, and remained trapped in the dark long after the rivers vanished from the surface. And in Mauritania, not far from the Western Sahara's broad emptiness, the Earth also holds a giant circular formation so large it is best seen from space, a structure that has invited questions about geology, erosion, and impacts. To follow the Sahara to its deepest secrets, we have to leave the painted walls of Tassili and look downward into fossil water, then outward to the great eye-shaped ring of a stone watching from the desert floor. Beneath the Sahara, below the dunes, gravel plains, dry valleys and stone plateaus, there is water that remembers a different sky. It is not the fresh rainwater of last winter, trickling down through soil and joining a lively underground stream. In many places it is far older than that. It fell when the climate was different, when parts of North Africa were wetter, when lakes spread across basins that are now dust, when grasslands opened roots through country that today can feel almost beyond life. That water sank downward through sand and rock, entered deep aquifers, and remained there in the dark long after the surface changed. The rivers vanished, the crocodiles retreated, the cattle herders moved, the stone circles stood alone, the Garamantes tunnels began to run dry, but some of the water stayed below, sealed in porous rock hidden from the sun, waiting through tens of thousands of years. This is fossil water, and the name is useful because it reminds us not to think of it as ordinary groundwater. In many wetter places, groundwater is part of a continuing cycle. Rain falls, seeps downward, fills aquifers, feeds springs, and eventually returns to rivers, lakes, oceans, and clouds. The system is slow, but it renews. Fossil water is different. It is water stored from past climatic conditions, often from periods when rainfall was much greater than it is today. In the Sahara, some aquifers contain water that entered the ground thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of years ago, depending on the system and location. It is not being replaced at the same rate under the modern desert climate. In human terms, using it can feel like drawing money from a bank account that no one is paying into anymore. It may be a very large account, but it is not infinite, and the withdrawals matter. The idea is strange when you sit with it. Water is usually the symbol of movement. It flows, rains, evaporates, freezes, melts, condenses, seeps, and returns. We think of it as restless. But fossil water is water that has been made still by geology. It has spent more time underground than any human civilization has spent above it. Some of it may have fallen before agriculture began, before cities, before written language, before the pyramids, before the Garamantes, before the paintings of Tassili. before someone at Nabta Playa placed stones to watch the sky. A drop of that water may have passed through a vanished grassland, filtered through ancient sand, and entered darkness while people elsewhere were still living entirely by hunting, gathering, and movement. Now a modern pump can bring it up in minutes. The speed of that contrast is almost unsettling. Across North Africa, large aquifer systems lie beneath the Sahara and its surrounding regions. The Nubian sandstone aquifer system, beneath parts of Egypt, Libya, Sudan, and Chad, is one of the largest known fossil groundwater systems in the world. Farther west, other deep aquifers store ancient water beneath Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. These reservoirs have allowed modern agriculture, settlement and industry in places that could not depend on rainfall alone. In some areas, deep wells bring up water for irrigation, creating circles of green fields visible from space. From above, they can look almost magical, bright discs of crops in a sea of desert. But the magic has a geological cost. The water feeding those fields may have been underground since the Sahara was a very different place. This does not mean people are wrong to use it. Water is life, and communities in dry regions have always depended on ingenuity. Wells, springs, oases, fogaras, cisterns, pumps and canals are all part of the human story of living with scarcity. But fossil water asks for a different kind of respect. It is not a seasonal gift. It is a deep inheritance. If used too quickly, it can decline faster than it can be replaced. Aquifer levels can fall, springs can weaken, wells can become more expensive to operate, water quality can change. In the Garamantian world, underground water made cities and fields possible for centuries, but as levels dropped and tunnels had to reach farther, the system became harder to maintain. That ancient lesson has not lost its relevance. The technology has changed. The pumps are more powerful, and the fields may be larger, but the basic question is the same. How long can a society build its future on water from the past? There is something deeply Saharan about this hidden water. The desert surface teaches caution. It shows dryness, distance, and heat. But the underground world tells a more complicated story. Beneath the desert are reserves created by climates no longer present, and those reserves connect the modern Sahara to its greener phases. A well drilled today may reach rain that fell when the region supported lakes, wetlands, and animals now absent from the landscape. It is as if the lost Sahara did not vanish entirely, it withdrew into stone. The water below is not just a resource. It is evidence. It confirms that the desert's present surface is only the latest expression of a much longer environmental history. Scientists can study fossil water to reconstruct that history. The chemistry of groundwater, including isotopes, dissolved minerals, and gases, can reveal clues about when it was recharged and under what conditions. Certain isotopic signatures help estimate age. Other chemical patterns show the kinds of rocks the water passed through. In some cases, researchers can identify recharge during wetter periods associated with past monsoon expansions. The water becomes a kind of archive, though a very wet one, which is considerate given how dry everything else is. It does not hold pictures like rock art or shaped edges like stone tools, but it holds time chemically. It tells us that rain once entered the Sahara in amounts modern climate would not allow across much of the region. And yet fossil water also shows us the limits of preservation. A painting can remain on a wall as long as no one damages it. A stone tool can lie on the surface for hundreds of thousands of years. But water, once pumped and used, is gone from that reservoir. It may irrigate a field, fill a glass, or support a town, but it leaves the deep archive. This makes it both precious and vulnerable. The Sahara's hidden past is not only something to admire, some of it is being actively consumed. That does not make the story tragic in a simple way, but it does make it serious. The desert's ancient water is one of the clearest reminders that deep time and modern life are not separate. We drink, farm, and build, with the remains of old climates. From the water beneath the desert, the story turns outward again, to a formation so large that it is easiest to recognize from above. In Mauritania, in the Western Sahara, there is a giant circular structure carved into the desert floor. From space, it looks like an eye. Rings within rings, pale and dark bands, a broad target shape set into otherwise open country. This is the irrigation structure, often called the Eye of the Sahara. For astronauts, it has long been a useful landmark, a visible pattern in the immense desert below. For everyone else, it has been a source of fascination, confusion, and occasionally very confident speculation from people who have perhaps spent slightly too long staring at satellite images after midnight. At first glance, the Riche structure seems like it ought to be an impact crater. It is circular, enormous, and dramatic. That is enough for the human mind to start imagining a meteorite slamming into the Sahara, blasting out a ringed scar and leaving behind a geological bullseye. Early interpretations did consider an impact origin, and it is understandable why. Many impact craters are circular. Some have raised rims, central uplifts, and ringed patterns. The Riche, seen from above, appears to invite that comparison. But geology has a way of being more complicated than first impressions, and the Riche structure is now most commonly interpreted not as a confirmed impact crater, but as an eroded geological dome. In that model, layers of rock were uplifted, forming a broad dome. Over time, erosion stripped away the layers at different rates, exposing concentric rings of harder and softer rock. The circle is not necessarily the mark of something hitting from space. It may be the cross-section of the Earth's own structure revealed by erosion. This explanation may sound less dramatic than an impact, but it is not less interesting. In some ways, it is more patient. Imagine layers of sedimentary rock laid down over deep time, later uplifted by geological forces into a dome. Then imagine wind, water, temperature change and erosion working slowly across millions of years, wearing away the surface. Softer rocks erode more quickly. Harder rocks resist. The dome is carved down until its layered interior appears as rings. What we see from space is not a wound from a single event, but the anatomy of a landscape exposed by time. The Sahara, once again, is not empty. It is peeled open. That said, the Richet structure continues to attract alternative ideas, including impact suggestions and even less grounded claims connecting it to lost civilizations or ancient myths. Some people have tried to link it to Atlantis, mostly because humans see a large circle and immediately wonder if Plato was involved. But there is no good archaeological evidence that the Richat structure was Atlantis, and the geological evidence does not require such an explanation. It is a remarkable natural formation on its own. It does not need to be a sunken city, a giant crater, or a secret message. The Earth can make astonishing things without outside assistance, and it has been doing so for quite some time. Still, the temptation to see it as an impact feature is revealing. It shows how the Sahara encourages big questions. After learning about Libyan desert glass and the possibility of ancient cosmic impacts, after seeing circular formations from space, after finding tools older than modern humans and art from vanished climates, the mind begins to expect surprises, and the Sahara does contain real surprises. It is only important to separate evidence from excitement. Libyan desert glass carries mineral signs of extreme shock and heat. The Risha structure, by contrast, lacks the clear shock features expected from a major impact crater and is better explained through uplift and erosion. Both stories are fascinating. They simply belong to different processes. The Risha also reminds us that not every secret of the Sahara is human, or even biological. Some are purely geological. Long before people moved through these deserts, rocks were forming, folding, rising, cracking, and eroding. Ancient seas covered parts of North Africa at different times. Sediments accumulated, tectonic forces shifted, Volcanic and hydrothermal processes affected some regions. The surface we see today is the result of immense geological rearrangement. Human history, even at its deepest archaeological scale, is only a late layer on top of a much older Earth story. The Richa structure pulls our attention downward into that older foundation. It says before the water, before the tools, before the paintings, before the tunnels, the rocks were already keeping time. There is a useful contrast between fossil water and the Richa structure. Fossil water is hidden, dark, and mobile only when humans or natural pressure bring it upward. The Richa is visible, bright, and still, a shape written across the surface. One is a secret below, the other is a sign above. Yet both are records of deep time. The water tells of ancient climates. The Richa tells of ancient geology. Together they make the Sahara feel less like a single desert and more like a library with different kinds of books. Some are written in chemistry, some in stone layers, some in pigment, some in tools, some in glass, some in ruined tunnels. The problem is not that the Sahara has too little to say, it is that its language keeps changing, and by now we can begin to see the whole pattern of the journey. The Sahara was not hiding one lost world, it was hiding many. There was the green Sahara of lakes, rivers, grasslands, fish, hippos, crocodiles, and people moving through a landscape that now seems almost impossible. There was the sky-watching Sahara of Nabta Playa, where stones may have marked the seasonal return of a lightened rain. There was the painted Sahara of Libya and Algeria, where artists recorded animals, cattle, bodies, and symbols across stone. There was the engineered Sahara of the Garamantes, where underground water channels fed farms and towns in the desert. There was the deep prehistoric Sahara of stone tools, older than modern civilization by almost unimaginable stretches of time. There was the cosmic Sahara of Libyan desert glass, born from heat and shock long before humans arrived. There was the spiritual and symbolic Sahara of Tassili's roundhead figures, whose meanings remain visible but not fully readable. And beneath all of it, there is fossil water, holding the memory of rain, while formations like the Riche reveal the deeper architecture of the Earth itself. This is why the Sahara should never be treated as empty. Emptiness is what appears when the present is too loud and the past is too quiet. But the past is there. It is in dry lake beds, old shorelines, buried channels, animal images, stone arrangements, aquifers, tools, glass, ruins, and rings of rock visible from orbit. The desert's silence is not a lack of history. It is the result of history becoming spread out, weathered, buried, and difficult to hear. You have to listen differently. You have to let the landscape speak in slow forms. There is something calming about that if we allow it. The Sahara does not reveal itself quickly. It does not rush to explain. It holds its evidence across vast distances and deep time scales, letting wind move over it, letting stars pass above it, letting human curiosity return again and again with better tools and more careful questions. The desert asks for patience, and perhaps that is why it fits so well into a quiet night of science and sleep. It slows the mind down. It makes ordinary time feel small. It reminds us that the Earth has gone through transformations far larger than a single life can witness, and yet traces remain. Imagine standing in the Sahara at dusk. The heat begins to loosen. The shadows stretch. The sky shifts from pale gold to deeper blue. Somewhere below your feet, ancient water rests in stone. Somewhere far away, the rings of the Richa structure lie open under the fading light. Elsewhere, painted figures wait in shelters, cattle cross rock walls, crocodiles remain engraved in dry places, and old stone tools sit among desert gravel, shaped by hands from a world almost beyond reach. Above, the stars appear, the same stars that guided herders, travellers and sky watchers, though their positions have shifted slowly with the long wobble of Earth. Around you the desert seems empty, but now you know better. It is full of absences that are really evidence. The absence of rivers tells us they once flowed. The absence of hippos tells us where water disappeared. The absence of living cities points us toward ruins and tunnels. The absence of written explanations makes the paintings more mysterious, not less meaningful. The absence of fresh rain makes fossil water more precious. The Sahara is shaped by what has gone, but what has gone has not entirely vanished. It has become trace. And so, dear listener, our journey through the Sahara's hidden world comes gently to rest, at least for tonight. We began with the idea of a desert that seemed empty, a place many imagine as nothing but sand, heat, and distance. But the Sahara has shown us something far richer. It has shown us that landscapes can change beyond recognition. It has shown us that water can vanish from the surface and still remain underground. It has shown us that people can mark the sky, paint vanished animals, build cities on buried water, and leave tools that outlast almost everything else. It has shown us that cosmic fire can become a jewel, and that ancient figures on stone can still hold questions no one has fully answered. So let me ask you again, softly, as the journey closes, where are you listening from tonight? Is it raining where you are? Is the air dry? Is the sky clear enough to see stars? Somewhere far away, under the Sahara, there is water that fell before our oldest stories were written. Somewhere in the desert, stones still face the horizon. Somewhere on a rock wall, a painted figure still waits in silence. And wherever you are in your own little corner of the earth, you are part of the same planet's long-layered memory. If this quiet exploration brought you a little calm, or helped the ancient world feel closer, I'd be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, or shared it with someone who enjoys falling asleep beside old mysteries and gentle science. The Sahara may look still, but beneath its stillness is motion spread across deep time, climates shifting, water sinking, rocks rising, people moving, stars returning, and stories waiting to be found. Sleep well, fellow traveller. And the next time you picture the Sahara, perhaps do not imagine an empty wasteland. Imagine a vast sleeping archive, golden and quiet, with a lost world hidden just beneath the sand,